Behold Jerusalem. Found. The Zodiacal Miracle in the Map of Britain and Northern Ireland and its Message for Our Time. By Graham K. Griffiths. Chapter 15. The Dark Twin. And I plan never to tell you of his existence. Oak forests came and went with the hawk's wing. Mountains rose and fell. He lay crucified with all his strength. On the earth. The Contender from the book Crow by Ted Hughes. General area. Although nailed to the same cross, and indeed sharing the same right hand as Jesus, this figure is hung slightly more to the left or east. Croglin marks the top of his head, while the soles of his feet rest against Archingarthdale. Here follows an account of how I thought I was losing my mind one evening a few days before Good Friday. I was already awash with my Peter-like rejections of the sight of that Jesus, hung so perfectly on Albion's cross, vehemently doubting that he was there. Like a drowning man, I lunged for something to save me from going under. I took a book from the shelf, knowing it contained a map to a different scale to the one I had in front of me. You see, in John Parker's book Cumbria, A Guide to the Lake District and its County, I needed urgent confirmation that I could not see that terrifying Christ, even though my pen had charged around his very evident form. Imagine, then, my reeling senses when, not only did I watch this second map testify that Jesus was indeed crucified in Cumbria, but in the same sharp intake of breath had to declare that I could see what looked like another Christ nailed slightly to the left of him, yet hammered to that same damnable cross. Yelling doubt scrambled my brain. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, get bloody angry, or just grab a jacket and run through the drizzle until inevitable wheezing and familiar sights, traffic lights, couples out on the town, glowing shop fronts of Chinese takeaways, would bring me back to the real world. And hopefully to my senses. But the jacket stayed where it was, for the artist in me remained calm. Out of the corner of my enraptured mad eye I could see just how miraculously this second figure too was formed, overwhelming the magic of the land that seemed to join two Christs by the hip and even sharing the same right hand. Twins, for a fact, hung on Albion's cross, a cross now doubly confirmed. I too hung spellbound, heart pounding, yet I was rooted to the spot, the rabbit in me wanting to bolt, while the artist wished only to wolf up the sight of it all. The rabbit's eye bulged, wanting to look anywhere but there, whilst the artist's was already greedily analyzing what definitely was there. That more trained-eyed, whether mad or not, was for the moment winning the tug-of-war. I was struck, first and foremost, by the more athletic physique of the second figure. Even his flowing mass of hair and beard seemed fuller. I sensed that, if freed from his nails, he would bound away like a leopard. Indeed, there was a definite hint of lithe wildness about him, whereas the first one I had spotted hung somehow calmer, almost serenely so. The second major difference I saw was in the actual positioning of their respective bodies. It seemed that the great heaving chest of the second had thrust his whole frame towards a very definite left-facing posture, whereas the first, although facing more or less straight on, had, nevertheless, a body turned to the right. Even though my heart was still banging away, my Albion-trained intuition was quietly aiding my bewitched eye and calculating that if the first was purposefully turned to the right he might be representative of the father's white positive yang side. His twins turned to the left would presumably then signal a leaning towards the mother's of black negative yin. Certainly his wilder demeanor seemed to confirm my reasoning, along with what would turn out to be a plethora of place names to bolster his role. Almost grudgingly I had to pronounce the first figure I'd found as Jesus, the Christ, but that second figure, and for all the above reasoning, just worried the crap out of me. So guess what I did next? Insanity had already suggested itself to me, even in the split second when I first saw those blue river eyes of the first figure, but with apparently twin Christs now resurrected before me, amid a heady mix of rapture and downright panic, the rabbit in me now began to regain precedence. So, in the space of a couple of cold and calculating moments, I stealthily maneuvered myself out of this agonizing corner by making it possible for me to forget that that second figure was even there. The rabbit, you see, calculated that not only would the wilder-looking Christ confuse the whole picture, but would also, and this probably much nearer to the nub of my raging concerns, force me into another mountain of work. I would not only have more to write, but would also have to fathom out what the hell he was doing here in the first place. All this, so near to what I thought was the end of my efforts in trying to put it all on a word processor, was a prospect that winded me as severely as a punch in the stomach. Sure, in stumbling over Albion I'd been on the trip of my life, and I felt truly privileged for the ride, but because I felt that it was imperative to let the world know of what was under our feet, along with a more practical need of putting bread back on the table after so long away from my work, I really did want to put the manuscript to bed. So it was a blessing that I didn't know then that I would be fathoming and one-finger typing for another 6 years. But that was not all, because the sight of that second figure had frightened me even more than the first had, and because of his distinct, wild look, I attempted to square things up with my conscience, because, of course, I knew damn well he existed, by branding him the Antichrist, the devil himself. I honestly talked myself into the theory that if I was to unleash this hijacker of Jesus' cross he could perhaps put the entire miracle and message into jeopardy. Thus, in now seeing myself as some guardian of the Grail, the dirty deal was done, and that threatened insanity seemed not nearly as serious as it had done but 30 minutes before. However, because of the remarkable phone call later that evening, which led to the finding of that Cumbrian Jesus Magnificent Grail Wound, CREs, Part 1. I was left with no alternative but to write that first figure I had found into the whole scheme of things. I just hoped I could make a quick job of it. Once seen, never forgotten, however, is true of all Albion's giants, and so that shunned twin refused to disappear. Throughout the many months it took me to write the chapter on the first figure, the second one nagged me, eventually to the point where overwhelming guilt forced my eyes back to meet his. That guilt, although I was within days of putting what I thought would be again the last full stop to the manuscript, thundered, "How dare you censor Albion?" And so here, to the delight of the artist, I can now bring home the last and most wonderful black sheep of this house of Albion. Whether insane or not, I thank God that I'm coming clean, for with hindsight I can see that, without him, this whole miraculous mirror of Albion would be tragically dulled, to the point where you could not look at it and see yourself reflected back. And this is, I think, its final purpose. Antichrist? No, rather just the Antichrist. It's laughable now, but in initially branding him the Antichrist or devil I'd been making exactly the same sorry mistake that most of the so-called civilized world has been making for the last 2,000 years. As we delve into how earlier cultures perceived, before the church advised otherwise, the one who I now think shares Jesus' cross, we'll find him to be a vital component in the sacred balancing act that has always had the transmutation of a man into a self-aware God-man as its ultimate aim. Therefore the land has rightfully hung him upon the same cross as Jesus, for I'm afraid to say that if I've read correctly Albion's near 50-mile-high replay of the Passion, it seems that without him symbolically holding Jesus' hand upon that cross, Jesus himself may not have achieved that same exalted state of a God-man, and would not have risen upon the third day as a Christ. And why am I reluctant to say that? Well, it's surely already provocative enough of me to say that someone else is sharing Jesus' cross, whatever his name or reason for doing so, but to then have to warn you that when we later overlay this landscaped replay of the Passion upon Golgotha's original we're going to have to struggle with the inference that Passion indeed gripped that central cross and the figure on it. If I read it correctly, the land seems to be telling us that Jesus is playing bodily host to some divinely orchestrated act of mystical sexual intercourse between the male and female aspects of the one God. Indeed, the sacred marriage is being consummated within him so that he can be reborn 3 days later as a Christ, heretically barking mad, or what? Though I'll have to take my chances at the stake, if what I've read in this stunning take 2 of Golgotha is only 1% accurate, how can I now feel anything other than relieved that I finally mustered not so much courage, but more of that childlike sense of adventure and trust to accept that all's well, as urged by Albion's own innocence in the soil. In doing so I fetched this dusky lord from out of the vaults of my own Christian-coached repression, because it's my belief now that that 1% means that here comes no Antichrist but rather the anti or preceding Christ, and is but the doorman to the knowledge of the Christ within yourself, however shocking his devil's foot may be, and believe me, the land has given him one of those too. I admit, since setting foot upon Libra's dove, I have shown you preposterous things and asked you to accept them. And, for sure, things get no saner in what the land shows us upon the body of this dark twin. So be warned that in our unwrapping of his much maligned body we shall expose layer upon layer of tabooed truth that, because it puts the word sacred next to sexuality, is today generally shied away from as degenerative and pagan, and I confess that I once thought that way myself. Yet if these findings are seen in the context of how the land has innocently re-illustrated them, I think you may find little to morally balk at. Somewhere on the boundary of our collective unconscious these same findings might be answered by a warm and sympathetic resonance, for Albion's ship also lies there at anchor, and on it things taboo are rendered innocently beautiful, free of the dirt that fear, born out of ignorance, has periodically heaped upon them. These so-called taboos, that are now part of this ark's cargo, have been gathered from the collective endeavors of generations who searched for the truth of simply why we're here. These, the fruits of their findings, are now presented as provisions for us who might be sailing to the very brink of either extinction, or the evolutionary leap of perception needed to avert that extinction. All creation, I think, at this moment trembles upon our decision. Shall we have sense of adventure enough to board this lifeboat and take up the keys left by the past, which just might unlock the door to a fabulous future, or shall we deny that such a miraculous Earth ship has even docked right in our faces? Because to see it will be to constantly admit just how much we've got wrong in the way we view this planet and the lives we spend on it. Those who do dare to look I know will also be adventurous enough to take a trip with me back to the first Good Friday, this in effort to detect what could be the chemistry of some monumental rite of sacred sexuality writhing within the breast of the crucified Jesus, in order to give birth to a Christ child within him. But you must also be ready to come up against what might be a 2,000-year-old fug of Christian propaganda, misconceptions, and just plain fear which could have robbed us of the true wonder behind the crucifixion, and thus tarnished the gift of what life on earth was ever meant to be, according to this landscape, a gift few have ever fully unwrapped. Setting our compass. Before we endeavor to allow the rightful shadow and twin of Jesus to both clear his name and re-educate us of the role he has in helping us achieve the realization of the divinity within ourselves, we must set our compass to what has been a recurring map reference throughout these hundreds of pictorial miles. In plain speaking, our way must be as much towards the black way as it is to the white, as much heading down the motherly negative dark, left physical and nature track as it is to the Father's positive light right spiritual path. And although I'm sure that to strike out on that road leading only to the light is to choose a safer route than heading solely along a darker course, I'm equally sure that Albion has been subtly hinting for miles that to aim only for the light might be to halve the treasure at our journey's end. Therefore I propose that to seek a neutralizing course down the center of the two ways, having one foot in light heaven, the other in dark earth, is the Grail way that Albion has been promoting since the dove. A compass reading now emphatically endorsed by the land's pertinent nailing of seemingly perfect opposites upon the one cross. Remember too that whilst on Albion's arc any old ingrained notions that all things black are possibly bad, while all things white are generally good are faulty coordinates. Mother Nature built no evil as a standard into any of her black creatures, nor has she singled out her white creations as especially chosen. Indeed, don't even take the word right as a vote of approval, or negative somehow as undesirable. Here two voices from the past vouchsafe pretty well the same. Light and darkness, life and death, right and left, are brothers of one another. They are inseparable. Because of this neither are the good good, nor the evil evil, nor is life life, nor death death. The Gospel of Philip. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate, good and evil, are both absent everything becomes clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. Sosen, a Taoist master. Trying to balance the mystic books. Having then set our compass as much to the dark as to the light, and because I'm asking you to put aside an almost genetically inherited set of basics for the supposed avoidance of trouble, a little reassurance wouldn't go amiss, especially since I know what's coming. Certainly I too had urgent need of some heavy reassurance, before I had balls enough to go for broke by owning up to this naked and cloven-footed hijacker of Christ's cross. And wouldn't this admission of mine be slightly less unpalatable, I thought, if I could show that, in the past, wiser men than I had also looked for a juxtaposition of opposites in order to balance the mystic books, so to speak, and who, upon seeing how the land has hung two upon one cross, would have themselves shouted, "Bingo!" Because of my lack of knowledge in this area, I didn't hold out too much hope of coming across any tracks belonging to earlier hunters of a mystical dark twin to partner Jesus, though, without too much sniffing around, I surprisingly had the nod and a wink I needed to bolster my confidence in coming clean, as it seemed that there really were some who looked for Jesus' shadow in order to account for the divine balance they felt should be behind all things. It was nice, too, to find out that I wouldn't have been on my own come heretic burning day. A wink came from Mary Cain, who suggested in her own book that, for some of these mystic bookkeepers, John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus, had filled the slot of some essential opposite. John perhaps fitting the bill not only in his wilder, crying in the wilderness, camel hair clothed, snacking on locusts character, but maybe he was also of a darker appearance than his cousin? Complexions, hair color, dress sense and rough manners apart, there was obviously some deeper reason running through the mystic's need of an opposite to partner Jesus, and being now schooled in Albion, I naturally suspected that they, too, must have been working on the principle that the positive, young, or whiter-orientated Jesus, must, as an esoteric law, be partnered by a counterbalancing reflection of himself and biased towards the negative or black yin polarity. If so, I further began to wonder if such twin representatives of the fundamental forces of heaven, a father and earth, mother, would have been primed to somehow mystically unite, a dissolving of one into the other, so as to promote some manifestation of absolute and balanced perfection, maybe even the ultimate figure of a Christ. Either way, I took that furtive wink from John the Baptist via Mary Cain to be a tentative vote of approval for the interloper on Albion's cross. Sure, the rabbit was turning mole again, and perhaps all this sounds to you like nothing more than another molehill of baseless speculation, and one that I'm attempting to build up into another Everest in an effort to give perfect reason for there being two figures nailed to Albion's single cross. Nevertheless, at this point I do have an advantage over you, for I'm basing all this on what I know is waiting at the end of our journey. The sight of the astonishingly animated finale that the land has been keeping up its green sleeve will speak for itself, saying that Jesus had to find such a twin and clasp his hand before he could truly experience himself as God. Furthermore, and still hoping that I'm reading the land correctly, I think Jesus may have instigated this particular part of his mission when he entered the wilderness, where even the Bible says he met the devil, or his own symbolically cloven-footed dark yin brother from the underworld, not someone to be fearful of, but purely the representative of the holy animal, vegetable, mineral half of the being we all are. So, even from the aforementioned wink, I was feeling reassured that the search of any mystic accountant was for the earthly, or motherly counterweight to him who had perhaps come to earth as the Father's emissary, and whose ultimate aim may have been to unite both Father and Mother within himself, to become the two made one, thus their true Son, a Christ no less. And I must keep stressing that this search was in no way for a twin of evil opposition, no matter how tempting to presume otherwise on the strength of the Church's way of seeing things. My intuition, however, urges that I should add to this that anything which is deprived of its balancing other half may become diseased to the point of becoming dangerous, evil even, and when Jesus went into the wilderness, that twin, perhaps already expelled from men's classification of what was holy, may indeed have been a wild and unbalanced man who needed his twin Jesus as much as Jesus needed him. Note, regarding my theory of those two fundamental forces becoming one Jesus, I accept the idea that all things, especially everything that is animated with life, may only exist because of this same essential union of mother and father. However, I think those old mystics may have sensed that only when man became fully aware of the divinity of both his material and spiritual identity, and by inviting those two fundamental male-female forces of the one God to consummate their sacred marriage within the core of his own bodily temple, could he split the chrysalis husk of the old self and step out as a God-man, a man still, but one who would thereafter intimately discover and commune with himself in all things. But I needed more than the Baptist's wink and my own hunch of an ulterior motive for Jesus' stint in the wilderness. I needed it backed up by a more definite nod of approval. One needed hard-nosed written proof from antiquity that I was not on my own in suggesting Jesus had a symbolic twin, and I got what I needed from the author of the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, who actually proclaimed himself, would you believe, to be Jesus' twin. Even his name, Didymos Judas Thomas, seems to have been doubly encoded with the same news, for in Greek Didymos means twin, while, in Aramaic, Thomas also means twin, thus the author's real name is Judas the twin. And are you thinking what I'm thinking? In the New Testament casting of a Judas to play the negative role to Jesus, and who subsequently also got blackened for his services, was there also hint of a symbolic twin? Indeed, was there a very strong hint that Jesus actually needed his Judas, the Scorpio-like odd one out of the 12, to help him reach his final goal, however painful the initial push? Seemingly a twin for Jesus was not such an original idea after all, and boy was I glad. Moles, though, have notoriously poor eyesight, I hear you say, and thus I accept again that some of the land's mystical small print on what's going on here may be beyond my reading capabilities. That said, this hanging of twins upon the same 300-mile-high cross was so utterly provocative, that the bottom line must be a proclamation that something phenomenally important happened over and above the Bible's telling of events on that first Good Friday. And, if we could understand this, it might not only enrich our lives, but may also be ultimately vital too to the well-being of the entire planet, for look, is not this poetic double act being brandished like a flag high above the deck of Albion's life-preserving ark? Indeed, was the robber to Jesus left, who went to paradise with him, representative of this same dark twin? In answer, Albion's own version of him will, at the end of our journey over this landscape picture of paradise, breathtakingly endorse the theory, however bizarre. Though if you are already troubled by the way this chapter is going, or should I say, in the direction this dark twin is pointing us, I say be especially glad. Here's how Judas the twin begins his own gospel. And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Jesus said, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all. Needless to say, the more I delved, the less uneasy I became in owning up to this twin in Albion's passion in a landscape, even though I knew the more I defended his presence alongside Jesus, the more difficult it would be for many a Christian to accept. However, because of the sheer beauty of this whole zodiacal miracle, and its raising of Jesus to cap its summit, I knew that only some news of extreme value could be behind this raising of a twin to partner him upon the mast of the ark. In another sense, however, one thing that I would discover in his makeup would remain to many as an anathema, no matter what his input to the rest of this landscape message. You see, in that unobtrusive word twin there was still a concealment of the problem I'd had since the first moment I laid eyes upon him. Although he, at first glance, looked to be a virtual reversed mirror image of the figure to his right, he still radiated an aura of untamed wildness, and when I would later discover his left foot to be quite possibly cloven, unnerving confirmation of my initial fear of him. I'm sure I really did hear the crack of Christian thunder and damnation above my head. A twin upon the same cross was iffy enough, even to me, but one with such a terrible foot meant I was saying that Lucifer was Jesus' brother. How the hell was I going to justify what the innocent land had done? How did the land wish me to read this one's presence into the whole scheme of things? Had I not already pointed a finger towards Scorpio as maybe harboring a disgruntled Lucifer? Once more one needed the past to re-educate me. I was still troubled, but I hoped I'd end up wonderfully astonished. The brother they never wanted us to know about. So I'd a dark twin on my hands, naked and with a devil's foot to boot. But hang on, was not his hoofed liability just an innocent sign to show us that he is of the great underworld, not hell, but purely the realm of the animal, vegetable and mineral, indeed, of all things solid enough to cast a natural and blameless shadow? Do all the accusations of evil heaped upon that accursed foot fog over the simple fact that he is but the representative of holy nature, and as such, no one to be fearful of, but rather to be accepted as indeed our own twin, one half of our own duality? Trying on ideas like this in an effort to alleviate my nervous twitch, I then went back to test drive thoughts that had been motivated by our ancestors' reverence for the mother's son, a lover, wherein I hoped to find more solace. Briefly, the concept of the son who becomes the lover was, to our ancestors, a perfect vehicle upon which to illustrate the regenerative qualities of the life force. The goddess, signed by the moon, immaculately conceiving of a divine son who would grow with the rhythm of the seasons into her consort, the sun, and although perennially dying, yet resurrecting again at the advent of spring, he would, with the return of the corn, guarantee the eternal circle where life always follows death. And the name they gave to this resurrecting sun? Adonis, Aeon, Attis, Bacchus, Dionysus, Mithras, Osiris, Tammuz and Zyptotec may have been a few of the cover names given to his many global incarnations. Certainly, all of these deities come across fundamentally as promoters of the concept of regeneration, and if regeneration is not a million miles away from resurrection, then all would have been somewhat Jesus-like too. However, because these laughing Mayday cavorters had flowers in their hair and inspired as holy an honoring of the earth and her cycles of fertility, as again did Jesus, although it seems all reference of this got edited out of the Bible, they were under Christianity's new broom swept out as degenerate. To the church, the earth had roots in hell, and anyone who saw differently was risking becoming the devil's own bedfellow. Thus the whole lot of them were cast out as being but the masks of the one and ultimate demon. Interesting name though, demon, derived, I discovered, from the Greek demon and meaning nothing at all scary, but pertaining to a divinity, a supernatural being who was an intermediary, note, not barrier, between man and God, also an inner or attendant spirit or inspiring force. Could we then look to this odd one on this cross, the one with the abominable foot, as a demon doorman, a guide or intermediary who will escort you through a leafy doorway into a hidden supernature, discovering there that, if rivers and rocks can consciously shape a near 50-mile-high Christ, then what wonders could you perform in collaboration with her, your mother, the earth? And when Jesus ventured into the wilderness, was it to sect this shaggy-legged guide or brother in order to experience exactly the same? Because that guide has since been branded by the ignorant as the ultimate demonic lord, our knowledge, kinship and love of the earth and her creatures have greatly diminished as a consequence. Could this be the reason the land has willed this cloven-footed one to hang hand in hand with Jesus on this Cumbrian cross? Again, I am an artist desperately trying to read these bewildering pictures in a landscape, and of course I could be hopelessly off target. However, appreciate that my strange theories are, for the most part, only based upon what others have previously discovered, believed or suspected. I have been permanently astonished to find that so much of what the earth has apparently depicted is but a gigantic graphic approval of many a hitherto unorthodox viewpoint. For instance, and remembering my suggestion of Jesus in the wilderness seeking his holy animal other half in order to better know his relationship to the Great Mother, you may feel that my earlier snipe at the Bible's possible editing out of a Mother Earth-loving, environmentally friendly Jesus has no foundation. Perhaps you just can't imagine Jesus actually referring to the Earth Mother at all, let alone speaking words that would honor her holiness. If so, I would like you to read another of Edmund Sekelly's translations of the ancient Aramaic texts which are claimed to quote Jesus' own words, unfortunately words that have no chance of making it into the Bible. Truly, no one can reach the Heavenly Father unless through the earthly mother. Refreshing to these following lines. They were spoken 2,000 years before the rainbow wagons of the New Age travelers come eco-warriors hit the road, and yet which could be from their own mouths. He who doth destroy a tree hath cut off his own limbs. Thus shall sing the children of light, when the earth again shall be a garden. Holy tree, divine gift of the law. For the trees are our brothers. And as our brothers, we shall guard and love one another. Here too just how close some of those earth-loving pagan deities were to Jesus in terms of their birthdays and deaths, even though they were revered centuries before Jesus ever drew breath. Take Dionysus, born in an ox stall. No, I didn't know that either. But when I did, I couldn't help wondering if Jesus' own birth in similar surroundings was itself a starred gesture to the divinity of his physical, or animal other half. Obviously, the editor of the scriptures didn't spot the code, so this lovely detail stayed in. However, some early Christians favored another version of the Nativity, which had it taking place in a cave. If it did, it would be the equally pagan Mithras who'd beat him to it this time. Why, baby Mithras even had 3 shepherds to witness his birth too. Oh, and the date of Mithras' birthday? December 25th, of course. These similarities are hard to ignore. They continue when we also learn that Adonis, Aeon, and Dionyse all had virgins as mothers, while each one died around Easter time, a nexus now hammered home by Albion's emphatic placing of Jesus and this many-named nature deity on the same cross. And what with their shared right hand being pierced with same binding nail, I think we get the emphatic picture. Heavenly Jesus and this earthly twin were always meant to be read as one, and seen in the same divine light. Simply, to my eye, the land is telling us that while we might have allowed the Father's Son to speak of heaven and the Spirit, we gagged his brother, the mother's son a lover, and never heard how equally divine was the earth and a life in the flesh. Indeed, until relatively recently. Wild nature was deemed by the Church as something inherently bad unless beaten into some usable service. So is it any wonder that when men consider the earth as dross and the flesh not much better, there could only ever follow the environmental damage we have today, along with the piled-up bodies from one ethnic cleansing after another? Nevertheless, I felt these thoughts and findings still only amounted to my first tampering with a lock, which, if I could pick it, could let me in on an even bigger reason why the land had seen fit to crucify the green man on the same cross as Jesus. My gut feeling insisted that there was still more behind this than had yet dawned on me. As I sank into deeper thought, Golgotha began to present itself more and more as the real key. Golgotha and 2 upon 1 cross was urging me that here was a combination that could blow the barrier erected by the Church off its hinges. How come? Well, Albion is essentially a zodiac ingeniously shoehorned into a Cancerian arc, and thus to have its mast crowned by, of all things, a re-rendering of Golgotha's non-astrological event, told me that even the stars had seen something extraordinary pass by unrecorded on that monumental afternoon of the first Good Friday, and, whatever it was must have been of universal significance because it has been replayed here with figures nearly 50 miles tall, so that we can't miss it the second time around. Moreover, this being overlaid upon the very mast of the ark can only mean that we'll need to understand all that we've missed by the time the waters begin to rise. I warn you again, however, that when we do attempt this second reading of the crucifixion with the evidence as nailed to the mast of this ark, something so astonishingly unheard of will be unveiled, something so challenging, yet for me so utterly enchanting, that I fear I might lose those readers who have hitherto stuck with me, even in my noting of buttocks at Nateby. But I hope not, for if the last chapter is to supply the fireworks, the resurrectional wonders surrounding Golgotha's passion, of which this present giant is shortly to sing, will supply the most perfect backdrop against which to see the sparkling crescendo of that final chapter. In the meantime, let me build up my case that this second figure on the cross is the mother's own virile consort, proudly yin in polarity, and thus blackened to hell by those who didn't know the worth of yin to yang. I'll begin by pointing out the many blackened and sexually orientated, but entirely correct for this fertility, God, place name labels stuck upon him. Names that were put there by the many unsuspecting helpers of the mother's grand design, confirming both his color coding and role by the black and white evidence on the ground. We may then be in a better position to understand what might have been the inner ecstasy behind the outer agony of Jesus on that awesome afternoon at Golgotha, and also to thereafter look at our own metaphysically cloven foot and see no curse in it. Time then to get closer, to feel your own twin's hot ox breath upon your neck, to smell upon him the mother's anointing scents, from the moist vapors of dank, dark peat and the mysterious underskirt sniff of a fly agaric, to the sugary sweetness of the 20,000 daffodils that we'll find blooming within his temple Sowerby armpit. Pick up from him, too, the rank stench of a decomposing badger lying in a roadside ditch, for he is as much death as he is life. This his paradoxical role from where the seed of misunderstanding has germinated, and which would grow on to bind him to his fate, for it has indeed become death which this lord of the underworld has been most associated with and thus cheaply condemned as evil. So, what a shame, for most of all he carries too, the hot musky odors of love's own mingled secretions, he, the unashamedly naked, Sperm-spouting, life-promoting consort, one to whom death was just an anteroom to life again. Though carrying such a tabooed scent, I guess, brought further opportunity for the church to taboo him to hell, along with the promoting of that life-insulting code of celibacy as the chain to keep him there. First of all, let's check off his markings of the dark and scary. The Shadow Christ begins to speak for himself. I must stress that this high-peaked area of Britain, in which both crucified figures have arisen, is for the most part one of beautiful and wide-ranging wilderness. The choice of roads, lanes, and place names from which to concoct, if that's what you think I've been up to since Libra, any picture are few and very far between, so to find one crucified Lord here in such astounding detail and with place name verification is for me a miracle in itself. But to find two figures side by side and upon the same cross still beggars my belief. But then I smile. For you should know by now that Albion defies any rule you care to throw at it. And so because they told us to always aim high, awash as it is there in positively good white light, and to steer clear of the darkened and therefore negatively bad below. We branded the one holy and the other downright evil, one the incandescent highway to God, the other a pitch-black alleyway leading only into the arms of the bogey man. So generations of us have been subconsciously programmed to think in this way. However, Albion is now suggesting that that divine high may not be as high as it could have been if one had first fathomed, and embraced the equally divine low thus, having already trod the body of him who equates to the light yang. Let's see if this, his supposed ruin, backs up my theory by aligning himself with the dark and scary yin. Smile with me then as this wilderness, which clothes him, gives up his misconstrued identity. Smile especially at that dreadful place entangled in his overflowing beard, for in that matted coarseness find the once warning sign of fiend's fell. See, too, black fell hanging among his tousled supernatural locks. There may also be a dark warning behind a tiny hamlet's name, for Hareskew is found nesting amongst the lashes of his left eye. Although perhaps not raising much of an eyebrow today, it may have caused suspicion to some early church father who would have known well enough that witch hares were especial fertility creatures of her who was wanton and him who was cloven, and so likewise tabooed the poor creature to hell too. And yet how this fleet-footed creature still managed to tiptoe into the Christian calendar. To the Anglo-Saxons the hare was sacred to Easter, the spring goddess, who is now remembered in the name Easter. Know, also, that the 1246 spelling of Hareskew will leave nothing to the imagination, it was the charming Harescock. Again, what an apt twinkle in the eye of the goddess' own spring consort. If I have deduced correctly, it's also worth remembering that upon the left, mother's side, eye of his brother, there is also intimation of the mother hidden in the place name of Manmade. This, I discovered, once meant servant of Mary, thus each twin has in his left yin eye a reflection of the mother. The same mother perhaps? Before moving on from this suggestively winking eye, I must also tell you that there is another place name relating to a hair upon this wild man. We find it on the wooded and thus delightfully bushy eyebrow of his right eye, in the shape of Nether Hareskew. So we have snared two of Easter's hairs, remarkably one in each eye, and uncanny to say the least, or is it? For me, I see he has eyes only for his lover Easter, bringing hope eternal for the continued fruitfulness of the earth. And because Easter means Easter, it's not only regeneration but also resurrection and rebirth that must be in the air if ever this twin opens his eyes. Speaking of eyes, how are his own eyes set upon the land? Could they, just as his brothers, be carved by a river too? And if so, is its name as significant as is that robbly water informing the eyes of Jesus, or would that be far too much to hope for? The answer is, no, on Albion it wouldn't be hoping for too much, but allow me the luxury of teasing you for a few more lines before explaining. A robber's mouth, a sniff of trouble, a wound full of yin, a vein carrying black blood, and a scarecrow's head. The jagged line of his mouth, perhaps showing a grimace of pain, is a 2.5-mile-long track, which ominously ends in the bog of Manmade mire, and would we get into the mire if we listened to him? Yes, would say the church. At the other end of the same track is the village of Manmade, the same place that marks the left eye of Jesus, and which we know once meant St. Mary's servant, so this green man must be telling us that above all else he speaks as the servant of the mother. Brilliant. What's more, of this Manmade corner of his mouth there runs a visual continuation of that robbery water which actually draws Jesus' eyes. So, besides saying that he is the servant of the goddess, which as her consort he assuredly is, does this twin also speak through the mouth of that robber who was hung at Jesus' side and whom the Lord took with him to paradise? If so, then to my ear his full and relevant message must be, I serve my mother or my lover. I was poetically hung as the robber at Jesus' side, but was really his twin who accompanied him to paradise. Without each other, neither of us could have made it. Note too another couple of places with a sniff of something ever so slightly negative and foreboding hanging around them. Check out the strangeness of Unthank and Gamblesby, both at the end of his nose. The yin theme itself continues with Blackton Reservoir that lies like an open wound upon his right thigh, and by the black burn, which suggests a thick watery vein down his left arm. Then on the very crown of his head I catch sight of Scarammanwick Fell and maybe a hint of another man whose scary arms were outstretched on a pole, a crucified straw-stuffed scarecrow man perhaps. Now a charred rib, and those eyes as all-seeing as Odin's own. We now have a couple of black birds which carry on the yin thing and both prerequisite species of those who have dealings with the underworld. Crowdundlebeck gives him one charred rib, while best of all it's the tremendously meaningful stream known as the Raven Beck which draws and fills both his cupped and closed eyes with tears. So, yes, this one's closed watery eyes are a remarkable copy of the way the robbery water formed Jesus's own closed eyes. Surely another resounding shout of "You'd better believe it!" to the fact that it is the intelligence of a supernature rather than blind coincidence that is at work here. I ask you, what are the chances of not only finding two Christs side by side and nailed to the very same cross, but both of them having perfectly cupped and closed eyes formed solely by running water? But, for me, more remarkable than this even are the actual names of the rivers involved, each name so damn pertinent to the one whose tears it carries. The by the robber example being all too easy to uncover, whereas, although I was instantly happy that it was the coal-black raven which colors the eyes of him who is the epitome of the yin, a little further research into the bird brought rewards which had me whooping with delight, for no better bird could a lord of the underworld have to aid his sight. Let me explain. The raven as a bird of mystic portent has been acknowledged ever since the dream time. To the indigenous people of North America, the bird was even thought to carry the medicine of magic to mankind from out of the void, which is the great mystery, and surely I don't need to remind you that upon his death even King Arthur himself transformed into one. But it is in the Norse myths that the raven helps us travelers of Albion to see the full import of the eyes we're looking into. For the raven's own mystic sight made them the virtual eyes of one-eyed Odin himself. Odin, underworld god of the dead, of poetry, of magic, and inspirer of the berserkers, those Viking warriors who'd wind themselves up to such frenzy that they could perform astonishing feats of wild daring during battle. Odin, the raven-sighted god, who learnt the secret of secrets by hanging himself from the tree Yggdrasil, which overhung the universe. Ask yourself if we now see Odin's act of attaining knowledge spectacularly mirrored in this land picture of an Odin-eyed lord of the underworld, hung as he is upon Albion's own tree-cum cross, and which, in all truth, overhangs the universe in the shape of all these terrestrial constellations we have now unearthed. Shame I never had the guts to show him in the colored artwork. I find it eye-opening to see yet more overlapping of myth upon myth dance off this landscape, testifying how blind we have become to the wonder of a life on this thinking, listening, speaking, remembering, and what must be, ever so loving, earth. The most ghastly, yet most beautifully telling, wound that man has ever had to feel into. Having then ticked off his dark and once thought scary markings, let's discover why those raven eyes are full of tears, both happy and sad, by zeroing in upon a mark which it seems the earth wills us to see, just a moment after first noticing his crucified presence. I say this, as it took only a split second more after I first saw his great heaving form, to spot that gaping wound upon his side, indeed, a wound far more glaringly obvious than that high-cup nick version on Jesus' side and which took that weird, though very wonderful, midnight phone call to make me see it. Anyway, button up those coats and join me in the moonlight alongside this dazzling wound. This burnished sheet of white brilliance upon his left side. It is a lake of some 2 miles in length and beloved of fishermen for its wild trout, The local fishing rule states that no man may ever take more than 12 away in his basket. Its known name is the Cow Green Reservoir, the largest lake upon his body. Its unknown designation is the Lance Wound, reflection of Jesus' own, of this, the shadow Christ, or perhaps harder to take, the green man who as I write is being sawn to pieces, rooted up, generically mutated, polluted by nuclear fallout, river poisoned, subjected to global warming, mad cow disease and a punctured ozone layer. His wound, then, filled to the brim with the Earth's own symbolic blood, is thus to be seen as the glaring wound of the entire planet, and one, let me tell you, that we've all had a hand in inflicting, from our double glazing's hardwood frames pillaged from another decimated rainforest, to the turning away of our famously blind eyes from the latest smashing of seal pups' heads upon the ice. And isn't that same blood-stained ice even now turning to slush, as a direct result, it is thought, of our appetite for burning fossil fuels, and yet we all carry on doing it anyway. And yes, I could go on totting up the crimes we're daily committing against him, the times we've all jabbed that spear in his side, but come on, you know all this already, otherwise you'd not have followed me this deep into Albion. And because we're looking in a mirror, I also don't need to tell you either that this one's gash is reflected back on the self-inflicted, and life-disenchanting wound of all mankind. Staring us in the face then, must be the deep wound of the mother material, just as high cup Nick must logically be now viewed, because if one bleeds, then so too must the other, as the high-peaked wound of the father, spiritual, that very peak a mere 4 miles horizontally west from where we stand in direct line with this 70-foot deep gash. And I don't know about you, but as I look from one wound to the other, I can only gasp in admiration at the amazing show of balance that nature has fetched from out of her own breast to brandish in our disbelieving faces. She couldn't be more forthright in her poetic plea that on this cross we see opposites in perfect harmony, even to the geographically high and low extent of their respective wounds. In this I see the repeated plea to acknowledge that the high spiritual is no greater than the deep, dense physical. Indeed, it must be complemented by it, otherwise a joint deterioration is set in motion. Looking from one wound to the other, are we also invited to symbolically take that Father's high cup, placed high upon the summit of Jesus' high cup Nick wound, and dunk it into this 2-mile-long Nick of all Nicks? I say yes. Oh, how these symbolic pieces begin to click together so poetically. 2 grail wounds, one black, one white, one high, one low, one to the west, the other to the east, and spiritually standing in the middle of the two, you are being invited to drink in your own divine joint nature, to drink in the mixture of the two and know yourself to be the one true God. So spin like a dervish of delight, the stars really have fallen down to worship at your feet, all is yours if only you can see through new eyes. But then let your arms flop to your side and wipe any delight from your face, for the danger our planet is in must be horrendous for her to give birth to this achingly wonderful miracle from out of her crust, in images of our own mythological heritage, and surely in the hope that its near universally known pictorial tongue might be understood by as many folk as possible. Thus even in her death throes she presents to us, her murderers, a gift in the shape of the most wonderful opportunity any man has had in finding out the reason for our being here, and to know just how much we have always been loved by every rock and leaf of this creation. Perhaps it is also a first and last chance to realize that if what this land has done is testament to nature being a sensitive mirror of our every thought and deed, we might, even at this late hour, begin to heal both our own blindness and the planet's plight. If everything is so intrinsically and sensitively linked to us, the land might herself respond to our belated credence of her divinity as manifested in this miracle of Albion, and with the same force of love which must have given birth to this wonder in the first place, might begin joyfully to heal herself in a way, and at such a speed, that might yet take our breath away. Am I mad, and you too, for coming this far on an impossible journey? Could all this really be? Do we moles prod at fact? Have yesterday's interesting, but basically naive, myths become today's sparkling chance to win through to a better tomorrow? But hang on, I hear some shout that Cow Green Reservoir did not exist until 1960, thus your theory that we've been following the well-trodden path of many previous hunters of the Grail comes somewhat unstuck. Previous hunters, upon reaching where we now stand, would have found no revelatory lake wound to freak them out on a similarly moonlit night a few thousand years ago. True enough, but only in part, would he my initial reply before adding, you see, any Grail seekers who might have passed this way prior to anything that happened in those swinging 60s would have freaked at the sight of a wound perhaps far more spectacular than even Cow Green by moonlight presents to us, seekers of today. I say this for exactly where this reservoir now glints they would have seen something that must have been almost a minor miracle in itself, the so-called Great Watery Wheel of the Tees. I will let David Bellamy and Brendan Qualley again from their book England's Lost Wilderness describe this natural wonder of Albion, now sadly submerged, the brackets being mine, near the stone pile on the southwest side of the reservoir. Cow Green you can stand and imagine where the Great Wheel of the Tees used to turn and turn again. This was not however a man-made wheel but a crescent of golden water where the river, Tees, turned in a great loop, circle of life, as if savoring the magic and delight of the place before plunging headlong over. Forgive me for the moment for stopping there, but what I'll tell you before I finish the above sentence is that the significance of where that fabulous loop of world water once plunged over, indeed where the waters of this replacement reservoir still fall, will make even us whoop a whoop that will have farm dogs barking for miles around. In the meantime, here's something that I hope may get you in the mood for that whoop, it's the intriguing significance behind that name Cow Green. But who is the green cow? There have been many cultures that have revered the cow as a symbol of the goddess bounteous fertility. We are even told that Mohammed's own daughter Fatima was known as the red moon cow who suckled the entire earth. Though we must return to Egypt to gain the full import of the name unsuspecting man has attached to the gouged out wound of the goddess consort. Standing upon the banks of this moonlit wound of a lake, it is relevant to know that to the Egyptians their cow horn-crowned mother, Isis, just so happened to be known as both the milk-giving cow goddess and the green goddess. So don't blame me for looking at Cow Green with great expectations. It is interesting too to note that the green cow's milk was linked in the Egyptian mind to the whiteness of the moon, which dribbled down from heaven to earth as the blessed rain. So, each river and stream was in turn seen as her running milk, a veritable water of life, for the suckling of all and the greening of the entire planet. However, connecting this Cow Green wound to the Egyptians' green cow almost demands one to seek topographical mention of Osiris too, because these two were so inseparable, and boy will we find him close by. Before we unveil him though, we must meet another personification of the great goddess the green cow, otherwise there's going to be big trouble. So welcome back Ceridwen, and guess where I've found her cauldron? As exciting as it is to suspect mention of Queen Isis upon English fields, there is one other lady whom we may not leave out of any motherly doings that are local to Albion. How could she who is depicted so brazenly cavorting as Virgo not be somewhere in this picture of her own consort? How dare Isis try to take all the glory? So make way. Here comes Albion's own green cow rushing down from the Welsh mountains to point out that she too is remembered in her consort's portentous wound. Hail, then, Ceridwen, undisputed cackling hag goddess of Albion. And as she comes, all black rags and venom, remind yourself of her cauldron of inspiration, of rebirth, and of all knowledge, that very prototype of a grail pot which we learnt of in our trip to Virgo. Just to taste a fingertip's worth of its liquor was to be gifted in a flash with absolute wisdom. She must be livid to see our small band gathered here like a gaggle of frozen little Gwyans at her cauldron's lip, seeking a taste of all it holds. At the cauldron's lip did you say? Sure thing. I suggest the above nameplay with confidence, as I believe her early grail-like pot has now evolved into the shape of this Cow Green reservoir wound of her son a lover, and in the symbolic sipping of its liquor, overlapped as it now is by blood, must be to drink in all the wisdom in the universe. Though I hear you counter, here he goes, trying to cunningly manipulate another chunk of juicy mythology so as to fit in with his equally cunning artistry. But, honestly, I'm not that clever, I'm just an avid adder up of 2 and 2. Listen, when Joseph of Arimathea held up the chalice that was used in the Last Supper to the side wound of Jesus, did he not inaugurate that blood and water spillage as containing vast wisdom, and fit to fill that more portable version of the Celt's cauldron? Unconvinced, aren't you? I see the old girl eyeing the doubt in your face, and she's sensing that she's going to make you bolt before you can dunk your own cup. So try this for size, the missing place name I'd omitted from Bellamy and Quayle's earlier quote of where the swirling broth from that great wheel of the Tees once plunged over, and which the contents of Cow Green's wound still spill headlong over to this day, is, wait for it, the Cauldron Snout, a boiling waterfall of both staggering beauty and now equally staggering portent. God, how it all just keeps on uncannily falling into place, of all the names to put at the pouring lip of this Grail wound. And admit, with such transparent evidence like this on the ground, who needs to be cunning? Certainly this is one of the most enchanting pieces of earth poetry yet encountered upon Albion, and one where any further words would be an insult to its succinct verse. The only thing I will do is to once more tip you off that when we come to the last chapter and see what the land has prepared as its final farewell, this same wound will sing even sweeter. Before we leave this incredible place, and while the night is still wonderfully deep around us, let's just hang around amid the sound of the Cauldron wound's mighty outpouring over that crag of a snout, surely now the most sanctified of all Albion's waterfalls. While we immerse ourselves in the rush of sound, let's kick around these last words of Bellamy and Quayle before they too bid farewell to Cow Green with not the vaguest idea of the significance of where they sat, though compelled enough by something in the atmosphere to write down these words. Cow Green is a good place to sit and reflect on all the other sacred Cow Greens in the world today, and on the wise management of the resources of this earth. My, how the goosebumps rush up my neck, but let us be on our way. In all his phallic glory. As perfect in both look and symbolism as this dark sun's wound is to the one received by Jesus at Golgotha, we must remember that we have here the consort of the goddess. So we should not be surprised to find some show of his rampant virility to prove it, but let me build up to revealing it. We now walk away from the beautiful wound of the Moon Maiden's lover. Her pockmarked orb is still lighting our way past the frosted fleeces of sleeping lambs, our breath like a troop of silver phantoms, and the waters of the River Tees, freshly tumbled from over that Cauldron Snout, chatter at our side, for both company and guidance. As we go, and to introduce what comes next, we ought very briefly to remind ourselves just how close the Moon and the Great Mother were seen to be in more sensitive times. Remember how those lunar cycles actually animated their mother. When the crescent moon hung sickle-like, they saw her in the guise of the maiden, whereas at the time of the full moon she was seen as being in full and pregnant motherhood. When a darkening moon came around they knew she had reverted to the old wise woman, now withdrawing her lantern of wisdom and fertility beneath her black shawl, though knowing that this same lunar cycle would return her to a maid once more. Quickening our step, and taking with us that word lunar as a talisman, we're led southeasterly by this wound's outpouring. Through the pass of the black-pillared rocks of the Falcon Clints that once, they say, echoed to the squeal of the Golden Eagle, today it's the call of the equally exciting Merlin Falcon that ricochets here. But the falcons are roosting, so carry only the sound of these chasing waters which, in the poetry of the land, are a rivulet of her lover's blood, a dribble of the goddess' milky water of life, a spillage from the cauldron of rebirth, sunken in the wound of the shadow Christ. Nothing phallic in that, you might say, but just wait and see where this same flow finally takes us. Jump across this bleeding of the Tees so that we may continue south by one of its connecting side streams, the Merrigill Beck, a continuation of the bloodline we're following and which in this moonlight, and from the window of a passing 747, really does seem like milk running thinly down this wild man's abdomen. Along this ribbon we go, past Cronkley Fell, to where a forest of pubic hair would not be out of place, for we're now standing just above this consort's genitals. Pity then, that there isn't a forest here. But hold on, Albion doesn't let us down, for where we stand the map has marked, in unusually large capital letters, the name Loon Forest, even though there's no forest to be seen. Now whether there once was a great forest here, or just another of those medieval tracts of relatively open hunting land, though nevertheless still termed as a forest, really doesn't concern us. What should interest us is whether there is a hint of a lunar link. Lunardale and Lunemoor certainly support this as they dapple like moonbeams the groin of him who is the lunar maid's springtime lover, and my hunch that there is something going on here glows even brighter when placing that name Lune above the head of a certain lady called Luned. Take a heathery seat in this glittering nightscaped wilderness, pull your collar up. Tuck your knees under your chin, and listen to a snippet from our wondrous past, which may yet return. The fountain at the axis of the world. Alluring name, I thought, Lund, especially when I saw how temptingly the name smiled out of Lumedale. I had never heard of the name until I came across it in the Mabinogian's tale of the Lady of the Fountain, but when I did, oh, how it was to light up this twin's groin with all sorts of sexual innuendo. It turns out that Lund was the handmaiden, perhaps even the personification of the goddess herself, at a sacred and magical fountain, a veritable fountain of youth, and to drink from it, I'd guess, was a virtual Grail experience. Certainly, such rejuvenating fountains were once a widespread motif suggestive of some rarefied place where either great knowledge, or some other life-enhancing experience could be had. However, the most celebrated of all these fountains was believed to be the one that cascaded at the very center of the world, or the Axis Mundi, the ultimate fording place between earth and heaven, a magical time-defeating crossroads where all knowledge was focused and made accessible to all who sought it. So, to put a cup to its sweet waters was to achieve a state of paradisal bliss whilst still being very much alive. It's not surprising then that the finding of its location became a quest within its own right. Listen to Malcolm Godwin pour more wonders upon this same location. The Grail itself is partially a manifestation of the Axis Mundi. It is the point from which all directions are established. This also applies to time, for as all directions flow from this point, so, at the center, all times occur simultaneously. Thus it could be said to possess youth-restoring properties. When I read that, I looked at the whole of Albion and saw in its gathering and overlapping of so many nations' myths and legends how, in a sense, time really has found a place to stay young forever. For this is the place where the golden fleece is still hung upon the Argo's mast, here where Ceridwen still chases little Gwion at the moment he shapeshifts into a single seed of grain, and just look at that sword in the stone, see how it too still waits here as a rock-solid truth, waiting to be pulled out into the brilliance of another golden age. And in seeing all this, and more, I couldn't resist wondering if all Albion is indeed that axis of the world, the center of some planetary consciousness, a highly aware focal point where the mother's focused will has whirled together a miraculous fording place where heaven meets earth, and golden myth finds a physical retelling. Moreover, and because of those Lune names dappling this apex of a miracle, could this high point of Albion's almost triangular floor plan have once spouted Lune's Grail fountain, here, upon the land's own green man, the eternal guarantor of virility, fertility, regeneration, rejuvenation, and resurrection? Difficult to answer, that one, and yet it gets easier when hearing that that ultimate fountain stood beneath the tree of life. Look where that Lune forest is in conjunction with the surrounding images of Albion. See it nestled alongside that great tree's very own trunk, that trunk of the cross, Albion's own tree of life. You're probably itching to ask if, at the spot identified with the name Lune, there is some sign of an actual fountain in memory perhaps of the Lady Lune's fountain. Well, if you're looking for a classical thing with water spouting mermen and the like, and a scattering of coins in the bottom, the answer is no. I'd hazard a guess that if ever the Axis Mundi was located here, any fountain might be just a front for a far more meaningful object. Therefore, there may well be a far more fabulous kind of fountain near where Lune marks the map, albeit one that disappeared from sight and mind after a certain King Amangans committed one of the most lamentable, mythological crimes ever. Later we'll hear just what he did, but for now let's get really phallic, we, who are lunatics all to the rest of the sleeping world, but, hey, I hope you're having as much fun as I am. Revealed one hell of a phallic fountain. Okay, we've been darting around his 40-plus mile tall body and checked off those labels that show how often he's been branded dark and scary, but as he is the lord of the underworld, this is exactly what we'd expect. And we've just collected further evidence that seems to hint at a relationship with Lune, the handmaiden at one of those fountains of rejuvenation, perhaps even the most sought after one of all. Indeed, because of her name's possible lunar link, she may, herself, even be the personification of the moon-guided goddess, his lover. But if any doubt still remains as to exactly whom we're hiking over, we'll now stop beating about his pubic hash and zero in upon the main attribute of any lord of fertility. So, stamp some life into those cold feet and let's be on our wonderfully moonlit way again. The River Tees and Merrigill Beck have done their job by bringing us from his wound and into this pubic Lune forest. Now we need to pick up another stream which, although not quite connecting to the Merrigill, is but a few strides away from doing so, and to my eye it is still part of that side wound's poetic outpouring. Argyll Beck is this new guide's laughing name, laughing, for its flow has been blessed to draw the left side of this naked twin's phallus, and what a phallus, the best part of 4 miles long. Moreover, the amazing signposts placed upon it will whisk us thousands of miles, from Cumbria to Greece and from Egypt to India, and so full of the past's poetic veneration of fertility and regeneration will these signs be that one will be hard-pressed not to see this landcraft as both celebration and endorsement of our ancestral know-how of a sacred sexuality. Let's then take a closer look at this naked consort's phallus, not a satanically plotted insult to the loinclothed Jesus at his side, but rather an innocent token to the glory of life. Thus, after describing the whole left or east side of his phallus, this cunning Argyll Beck finishes its artistry at its very tip, at which point it is perfectly met by another merry beck, called the long grain, which draws the right side of the phallus. At the tip the two becks then combine as one flow and trickle away like a stream of urine. However, to interpret that flow in that way would be a tragic oversight, especially after taking a closer look at what the map has to say. Spread that map out in the moonlight, and use a fingertip to reaffirm how the streams that led us to the tip of this phallus seem to be trying to keep turning the eye back to that cow-green wound. The obvious conclusion, then, is that their merged flows are meant to be seen as part of that Grail wound's outpouring, and because this same water of life, moon milk of Isis, goes on to pour from the very tip of the phallus, surely the message the land is trying to convey is that, far from urine, this spurt from the phallus is a continuance of that wound's own rejuvenating cascade of wisdom. It must, then, be logically decoded as a veritable stream of life, indeed, an ejaculation of semen, and what better to spurt from the Lord of fertility? Indeed, what better fountain motif to grace the acts of the fertile earth? You may at this point be thinking, of course he wants to see the flow as sperm to validate his theory that this figure is a lord of regeneration. But you don't have to take my word for it. Allow the land to speak for itself. Found that missing bit of Osiris. Alright, I'm saying that we're now gathered before the lunarlit phallus of the many-named Lord of Regeneration from whom cascades the water of life, but you need more proof. Well, Egypt can supply it. We've already heard how, after the murder of Osiris, which led to him becoming another regenerative lord of the underworld, he was found encased within a tree by his wife and sister Isis. We know she eventually frees and rejuvenates his body from this incarceration by her own magic, but only so that Seth, his brother and murderer, can order the body to be destroyed once and for all by having it butchered into 14 pieces and these scattered to all points of the compass. Distraught, Isis then searches for the dismembered parts of her beloved and, bit by bit, finds and buries them with dignity where they were found, marking each burial with a shrine. However, there was one part of Osiris she didn't find, for his penis had been swallowed by, of all things, a fish. Note, Osiris was butchered into 14 pieces, so do remind yourself that Albion just so happens to have 14 stations for shrines, that make up its own body of wisdom. Curious fish food, a phallus, wouldn't you say? Wouldn't it have been more dramatic if, say, some lion had scoffed it? Curious or not, though, I'm going to show you just how such a threatening piranha comes within snapping distance of this dark twin's willy. If you look back along the Argyll Beck side of his phallus you'll see that in the course of its cunning work it actually runs in and out of a very conspicuous lake, for, not only does it nudge the very side of this phallus, but carries too the name Fish Lake, and what's more it even has a good go at shaping itself into one too. Charming coincidence, that of all things it's a fish that nudges this landscaped phallus. Or are we being told that the memory of Osiris really is honored in the shape of this once globally acknowledged consort beneath our feet? Then, when one finds a possible memory of his lover Isis reflecting back from that flashing mirror of a lake wound upon his side, I can only reply, coincidence. Do me a favor. I had earlier suspected that Osiris might lurk in the soil beneath the figure of Jesus, but I had been turning a blind eye to what must be his very own portrayal in this dark twin. But was Osiris ever mentioned as being especially dark? Well, yes, to that too. Bering and Cashford write that, not only was he known as the Great Green Thing, but also as the Great Black Thing. Osiris is then found whole again, not below the first Christ, but paired alongside him, both counterbalance teachers, who share the same cross and the same right hand, a union which, in the next chapter, will become dazzlingly animated. Of course, I gratefully took the finding of a fish nipping the side of this Lord's phallus as another almighty clue from the past that I was on the track of no devil, but only the life-loving consort of the goddess who, in one incarnation, was named Osiris. However, vindication of whose phallus I'd found continued to gush. Why, it became such a flood of disarmingly descriptive imagery, so innocently shot through with love and life, that I have now not the slightest qualm about summing it up as intensely holy, even though such topics of a sacred sexuality would never be spoken of from a Sunday pulpit. No matter, from the banks of this stream-sculpted phallus, and beneath the moon set against the procession of the zodiac, it'll sound just beautiful. To hear more of this tabooed sermon, we'll now take a short stroll along this Lord's silvered ejaculation. A bridge back to the sanctity of love and life. Join me now by following the combined flow of those two phallus-sculpting becks as they race away from its tip, an ejaculation that will soon see speeds beneath a small bridge, and whose name shall give massive authorization to the role I've said this wild man is playing in Albion's scheme of things. Indeed, when I found it I knew once more that I'd found no anti-life demon but a pro-love and life demon, a demon. In your imagination, join me on this lonely moonlit bridge that spans this Lord's spermy flow. For me, it is the most enchanting bridge in all the world, which some either gloriously knowing, or wonderfully unaware, contributor to Albion's wonder work named for this day of magical revelations as the Grains O, the Beck Bridge. Granted, at first glance, there's not much to get excited about, but when allied to the poetry underfoot, and to what our ancestors once believed, I assure you that it'll begin to sing the most gorgeous affirmation of the divinity of the life force and the particular giant underfoot. A song that shall become an all-embracing symphony centered around the theme of sacred sexuality, music forbidden in the West for nigh on 2,000 years. As honored spectators upon this balcony beneath the stars, and with the consort seed spurting beneath us, prepare to watch the root of our ancestral belief ripen in a shock of corn gold light that the great Osiris will walk through. His appearance is not due to the hand of a multitude of Egyptian navvies shipped in for a busman's holiday, but solely to the worms working in unison with the rains, to glacial movements working in harmony with the plough, all at the behest of God as a sign that what was once believed of Osiris, and other corn deities, should be as sacred to us as it was to earlier peoples. Their value to our understanding of the God in ourselves is as profound as the guidance left by Jesus himself. What is more, you'll now be left in no doubt that in netting that phallus-gulping fish we have, via innocently collecting the 14 parts of Albion, made Osiris, Lord of the Underworld, whole again and ready to retake the microphone, though not to speak of death, but of life. 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 Now we've made him whole again, let's watch his grains of truth sprout golden. Leaning over our Grains O, the Beck balcony, we will watch something reflect back off that silver semen stream. That would have been as recognizably holy to the Celt as it would have been to the ancients of Egypt, Greece, India, and, for all I know, to the wise of many other cultures too. The first image that flashes back comes when hearing how the women of ancient Greece would plant alongside the scattered grain miniature ceramic phalluses, in symbolic gesture of guaranteeing the fertility of the crop. From another glint, my suggestion that this stream is an allegory for the ejaculation of a nature god seems to receive a flashing confirmation, this time from India. Shiva, India's own god of fertility, himself unashamedly naked, would ejaculate his life, giving seed into that holy river Ganges to fertilize his bride, the earth. Alain Danielou in his book The Phallus, states that even today in some Hindu rites a sperm substitute is concocted and poured upon the soil in portrayal of such seeding of the mother, this libation being made from rainwater mixed with rice grains. Thus, if water plus grains equals the poetic sperm, the earth's lover, I say check out again where we stand. Before us a phallus, half sculpted by the watercraft of the long grain Beck, and then, for good measure, this same stream finally ejaculated from its creation by way of speeding beneath this bridge they call the Grains O, the Beck, and I ask who can't be intrigued by it all? However, this same fertile poetry gets even easier to add up when we return to Osiris Egypt, and so it should. Seeing that is lying before us. Get ready then to break the silence of this night with another whoop of delight that might even carry to the hanks of the Nile. The whoop begins to build up when we hear how each year, Osiris would be invoked to push the new wheat back up through the crust of the earth, his own body, from his realms in the underworld. Naturally enough, such regeneration of the land was correlated to the resurrection of the dead, who, like the sprouting grain, were seen as being guided back from out of the dark realms by Osiris. To guarantee this life anew, beautiful tokens of the ever-returning Osiris would be placed with the dead by their mourners. Fraser's The Golden Bough mentions some lovely homemade examples of such tomb offerings, and for me these are far more beautiful than any effigies of gold, for although worthless they were imbued with the poetically priceless potency to sprout life long after the tomb had been sealed. However, the first example I'd like to mention was somewhat more sophisticated than the homemade variety we'll hear of next. The tomb in question was that of a royal fan-bearer and dated from 1500 BC. Inside, a linen-covered mattress was found onto which had been painted a life-size image of Osiris. And although the bed itself was doubtless wonderful, there was a greater beauty to come. Within the reeded rib cage of that mattress, a damp vegetable mold had been packed and impregnated with barley seeds, which the archaeologists could see had actually sprouted in the dark of the tomb in an attempt to break through the outer image of the god, in a splendid token of resurrection. What a lovely gesture this was, although there is even more to fascinate us, standing, as we suspect, between this god's legs. Indeed, it seems that the earth is saying that in these simple poetic tokens of the ancient Egyptians there was something of profound and holy worth, and that life and the spirituality of those peoples who practiced such beliefs bloomed the better for it. Those smaller, homemade offerings, found in many other tombs of lesser stature, were made by again using dampened vegetable matter, and squeezed into the very basic shape of small green doll effigies of Osiris. These, too, were studded with seeds of grain in the hope that they would sprout after the tomb had been sealed. But best of all, guess where Fraser states these tokens of everlasting life were always placed in relation to the corpse? Answer: between the legs, indeed, the exact and doubly grain-underlined location where we now stand watching such ancient imagery burst new and golden before us. To seal the whole scene before us as another series of interrelating myths made stunningly one and recorded in the landscape, let me now tell you the name of the stream which spurts from that phallus. This water that shoots beneath our feet upon this magical viewing platform of the grains the Beck Bridge is the River Lune. Ring a bell, does it? It should do. So come on down, Luned, handmaiden and probable personification of the goddess at the Grail Fountain of Rejuvenation. And as the pennies drop, surely they stack up to the disarming fact that we could well be standing before the enchanting truth behind her fountain, in the shape of this moonlit and cascading phallus of Lune's consort. Add to this the observation that the River Lune is, in essence, Isis moon milk falling from out of that cauldron or grail-side wound, and you're also witnessing in this ejaculation a visual continuance of those very same waters of life, of resurrection, of rebirth, along with all the wisdom that can make such a reality. Now tell me, what better source could there be to supply the fountain of eternal youth or indeed the phallus of the Lord of Regeneration? Incredible, isn't it? But even this isn't all. If Osiris really does account for a layer of this particular giant's makeup, and if you feel easy with his orgasm of grain-rich semen, then get this too, another name under which Isis was known was the Lady of Bread. So, who cannot see this consort's grainy ejaculation as having her name written upon it as clear as any DNA proof could give as to who we found at the height of Albion's near pyramidal pile of stars? Indeed, if Luned herself was another name of the mother, we can see double verification in that River Lune of whom this ejaculation is targeted for, the many-named great goddess. When I also float upon these magically fertile waters bearing and Cashford's reference to Horus, the child born of Osiris and Isis, I think it really is message received and entirely understood. The new life in the grain is the child of them both. I find the seemingly phallic truth behind that ultimate fountain at the axis mundi divinely disarming. Here is no streak of devil's piss, but that spurting to the glory of life everlasting seed of the land's lover. As we look down from our little bridge, see how we are all reflected in it. And does all this amount to some Eucharist of the land? What with the Lady of Bread being written all over this Lord's grainy orgasm, which is linked via other streams directly to his side wound, are we now getting a picture which prompts further thoughts? The combined imagery of blood becoming a water of life, indeed a poetic wine, and this crucified Lord's sperm carrying the overlay of grain may be inviting us to share in some kind of Eucharist. Is it an invitation to partake of his body of wisdom? Are we being urged to dip the highest cup into this stream, and have it brimming over with the very same as Jesus offered to his disciples at the end of the Last Supper, a culmination of all the wisdom one needs to acquire a life eternal? A few more pleasantly phallic findings. It's all so magical, the possibility of cups being filled, and we, standing at the tip of a fountain like phallus, being poetically showered by such enthralling possibilities. So, glance to your right towards that twinkling light of a lonely farmhouse, once a wayside tavern that bore the same name as the bridge upon which we stand. At that time it would have been a watering place for all who thirsted in the wilderness. And how charmingly apt if once upon another time this place had been recognized as the delightful end of the quest for those who sought Lune's fountain. With a beer on my mind I now flit back to that place name, Lunedale, and wonder if it cheekily remembers the once fabulous potency of Lune's ale that spurted from her lover, the rustic Christ in the landscape. Vulgar. I still hear some cry, at my poetic suggestions of drinking from a phallus. To this I would only express sadness though, for you have obviously learned nothing from the innocence that is Albion. Reading Albion is an art in its own right, and I do not claim to have a degree in it. However, for anyone who may think that my reading of a phallus in the landscape is sure sign that I am indeed insane, my grin nevertheless remains. Indeed, it gives way to a schoolboy guffaw when my eyes drop just to the side of where I say it swings in the moonlight. The place name is Cock Lakeside, and who, knowing what we know now, can't read that as a lake by the side of the cock? But then the smile is wiped off my face. Joking apart, I firmly believe that the map's blatant overlapping of semen and grain might be far more than the simple endorsement of the wisdom behind ancient fertility beliefs. Certainly, we've already seen, under Virgo, how a sperm and any seed with its taproot are visually very much alike. Virgo's forceful pointing to that grain or sperm-shaped Bardsey Island has me wondering whether, in this whole grain-overlapping sperm riddle, there is as much warning as there is celebration. I'm even more convinced that such is the case when seeing that this imagery has been provocatively hammered to the very mast of the life-preserving ark itself, and I wonder whether something I heard while pondering on this very point might be getting close to the nub of such a warning. A friend of mine, who'd read a newspaper report, alerted me to the sickening news that an American company, involved in genetic research, had developed some new wonder strain of wheat which it planned to market in third world countries. However, the sting in the tail of this deal was that once the third world farmer had harvested his new crop, he could not keep any of the seed back for replanting, for the cunning company involved had genetically doctored the grain seed so that it would actually render itself totally infertile for another crop, the first grain seed ever to purposely terminate itself at the point of it turning gold. Thus the phallus of this Osiris in the landscape would, in the poetic mirror, spout no life, only impotent blanks. Likewise, in our tampering with sperm in laboratory bottles, and the now not too far-fetched prospect of couples ordering up a Beethoven with blue eyes, there may be similar warnings that we are near to committing some profound and irreparable crime against the universal law of life. A final upsetting of the harmonies that make it all possible. With thoughts like these, I think it's time we dug through into another layer of this giant's mythological character, where we may find ourselves paying a visit to a very sick man. Indeed, we may even find that in this sandwich of global consorts, the land has made this character the one at the top of the pile. Hail the king! For shrines that make up its own body of wisdom. We must now leave our wondrous little bridge of grain between the legs of Osiris by following its sacred underflow away from the phallus. Lune's water of life, the river Lune, now leads us east and down to his thighs, where the horizon is showing the first hint of the radiance that heralds the dawn. Quickly now, for we must witness the last unfoldings of this twin secrets amid the beautiful half-light, that twilit in between time, when night and day dark and light, embrace and hang in each other's arms as equals for a few fleeting moments just before either sunset or sunrise. As we go, add up the simple face value of the signs now coming into view upon the left thigh of the twilight world's own Lord. Start by considering this: if the Lake of Cow Green is topographically assigned as a wound, surely it's logical to equate any other lakes upon his body as further wounds. If you agree, see how our guiding river Lune has just filled 2 more gashes in a line, those of Sailset and Grassholm reservoirs. Notice, too, directly opposite us, upon the right thigh another row of wicked watery wounds: Balderhead, Blackton, and High are their own injurious names. Note, Balder, by the way, was a Viking nature god, and so well loved was he that, upon his murder, even the rocks cried. So just who the heck is this giant underfoot? At first I said he was some symbolically wild John the Baptist, the down-to-earth, young cousin of a perhaps more heavenly or young-orientated Jesus, presumably to balance the mystic books. Then it was a conglomeration of an Osiris, Mithras Dionysus-like consort, son of the mother that we had a strong body of evidence for. But then our eyes have to go and drop upon these terrible thigh wounds and have to concede that neither John, nor Osiris, nor any of those other corn gods, nor for that matter even Jesus himself, were reported to have suffered such distinctive wounding. Albion is, however, a hall of mirrors, and many myths from many cultures have seemingly come here to reflect back as the one message they perhaps always were, and whenever I've met with a perplexing reflection shining back at me, I've often found it helpful to return to Britain's own mythological heritage in the hope of finding a more focused decipherment. Accordingly then, let's go back to the medieval romances of the Grail to try to find a further ID for this now profusely bleeding man, these tales being so intimate to British soil and already an absolute boon in helping to translate much of this vast conundrum. And wouldn't it be good if we could start by finding someone within those homespun legends who was perhaps also underscored as the consort, pushing our luck? Not at all. Without further ado then, let's follow this scent of blood to the Grail's rich Fisher King. For no one else in those romances bled quite like him. What's more, once we have pinned this slippery character down, we're going to be within a whisker of achieving the Grail itself. For let me tell you that he was also that cup's guardian, as it was known to materialize within the halls of his castle. Thus find him, find the Grail. But hold your horses. That Grail questing knight, clever enough to have found the Fisher King's castle, had then to ask a certain question of the king regarding the nature of his obviously mystical wounds which, although not life-threatening, bled incessantly for years. Indeed, to ask why those wounds bled so, would not only heal them, but also healed the so-called surrounding wasteland. And don't let that obvious link of the health of the king and consort being synonymous with that of the land pass you by. The reward for the asker of that vital question, however, was the achieving of that holy cup, in short, self-enlightenment. Hence I think it's time we too began asking some searching questions of his wounds, and we'll begin by inquiring after what may have been their primary cause. The Great Desecration. Buried in the human psyche there really does seem to flicker for some a sense, however nebulous, of a once paradisal time that came to an abrupt and cataclysmic end, triggered by some profound wrongdoing of mankind. I've heard it said that some collective unconscious memory of the sinking of Atlantis could be the truth behind this twilight sense of loss. Indeed, even the paradise found and lost story of Adam and Eve could itself be but the poetical flotsam and jetsam from the same catastrophe. Certainly, there are many tales from around the world that carry similar traces of some sunken golden age. Perhaps from this same collective unconscious memory came those tales of when man lived in greater harmony with his surroundings, and nature responded by revealing sacred springs, wells, and fountains. Again, anyone who drank from them would find that the veil that separated heaven and earth would dissolve, and I presume that that fountain in Lune's care was such a place. However, as quickly as Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves, so these fording places between heaven and earth also retreated beyond man's perception, and this in response to a terrible crime. Enter now King Amangans, who I mentioned earlier. It seems that these rarefied locations were all attended by the Earth Mother's own handmaidens, these, her personifications, being virgins and revered as such. But as is the way of men, There came along one day a certain King Amangans who had no such sense of sanctity or respect for either place or lady, and raped the first fountain maiden he found, a crime compounded by many other men who suddenly felt free to follow the king's example. We're told that the result of these defilements left the fountains dry, the wells rank and the maidens bleeding at every similar sight. As a consequence, the state of paradise shrank back from the fields like a tide that did not return. Almost overnight the earth lost a gleam of wonder that we of today cannot conceive of, and that which was left became known, by those who perceived the loss, as simply the wasteland, the same place where we reside today. And boy, how we still fuel that ill-born title. Mirrored impotence. The rape of the handmaidens and the resulting gulf set between heaven and earth, man and consciousness of his own divinity, was also to be mirrored back upon him who, in the medieval author's mind, was at the time recognized as the king with the strongest affinity to the land herself, her consort no less. It was, therefore, unavoidable that the rich fisher king would receive a crippling wound whose bleeding could not be stanched. Understandably too, because the land had lost its vigor, the rumor was that this wound had been inflicted upon the consort's genitals, again very Osiris-like, and thus rendered him impotent. But I reckon that wounding could have gone far deeper than even this. Think about it, because man is also in essence one with the land. Could the king's wound also reflect back upon all forthcoming generations until Amangan's crime could somehow be undone? The natural law of mirrors, I believe. If so, how we daily exacerbate this blighting two-way chain reaction by perpetuating Amangan's ignorance. And sure, although none of us literally bleed in sympathy with the fisher king, I wonder if we mirror him in the leaking away of some essential perceptual skills, this dulling of our awareness, not only to our own divinity but to that same divinity which exists in all things around us. Today that leakage might have become a torrent. Needless to say, the blinder we get, the greater that torrent, the faster the undermining of the whole creation, and guess what, even that ongoing decline gets likewise reflected back in myriad ways upon us. Again, that law of mirrors. Of course, the corn still comes through, swallows still return with warmer weather and folk still happily reproduce. Why, our lifespans are even getting longer. But in that perpetually repeated crime of Amangan's I must also ask if a slow, seeping damage on a myriad levels has been set into almost unstoppable motion. Are we, in fact, partying on borrowed time? I think many today sense the cracks under the pretty paper. Amangan's wrongdoing, I suspect, was but a mythological cloaking of the truer reason for the evaporation of paradise, more likely due to some mass turning away of mankind from the reverencing of the Mother Earth. And from this stemmed the general dulling of the perception that had hitherto seen wonders of which we, the inheritors and continuing propagators of the wasteland, are today unable to comprehend. But then I see Albion. Perhaps all is not lost. Simply, and we've been suspecting this ever since Gemini, and certainly under Scorpio, the natural law may insist that what we give out is what we shall receive, mistreat the land, view it as a commodity, see no divinity in it, and not only does the land become diseased and unbalanced, but the perceiver does also, existence but a shadow of the gift it should have been. Therefore, and in true mirror-like fashion, the wound was, and still is, perhaps self-perpetuating throughout every aware atom of creation. And this replicated scarring forever spurred on by the blindness of generation after generation. Anyway, the legends predicted that this wasting condition of both land and king, and, of course, mankind too, would continue until a time when that inquiring and perceptive Grail Knight, and perhaps, ultimately, all mankind, would come and by his questions unblock the sacred fountains and springs. These questions, it was said, would simultaneously heal the fisher king's wounds and free paradise to surge back into the perception of all those who thirsted, like a great tide cleansing and healing all that it overran, leaving everything re-enchanted. Alas, the planet has been waiting so long for men and women en masse to ask the correct questions that not even the chroniclers of the Grail legends could conceive of the consequences. They couldn't imagine that our continued blindness to our relationship with nature would become so profound that the time would come when we could, without a moral care, turn our cattle into virtual carnivores by feeding them the carcasses of crushed sheep, could even feed pigs to pigs and chickens with their own shit and feathers, and then feed the lot to ourselves. These medieval chroniclers would also never have comprehended that such gross disharmonies could be committed that eventually, they would cause a hole to be burnt out of the sky, through which the sun's rays would fall on the heads of folk and leave their skins blotched with cancers. Note, why even that name a man guns could well be itself, but shorthand for a man, though representative of millions. Lifting the king's robes. But I was speaking of the Fisher King's own wounds, and we now need to lift his robes and take a peek at where exactly they are. Now, if we see lakes as implying blood-filled wounds on this giant underfoot, that fish lake upon his phallus becomes an even clearer signpost to affirming, not only Osiris' own loss of potency, but also to that rumored wounding of the Fisher King. Indeed, doesn't even the name of this particular wound, fish, more than hint at the actual name of the character nearest the top of this pile of consorts? But don't make your mind up just yet. Okay, but if lakes are wounds, what are those we've just found upon his thighs? Is the obvious next question. In answer, we're told that other reports of this king's grievous wounds placed them upon his thighs. Can you believe it? It seems then that we can't put a foot wrong upon this incredible body of evidence. We've got two accounts of the mythological maiming to the Fisher King. One says it was the genitals that took the blow, while the other, more curiously, points to his thighs, yet evidence of both is to be found both graphically and anatomically accurately reflected off Albion's land mirror. However, the gobsmacking evidence does not end here, for what if I told you of another rumor as to the manner of this king's injury? And, as unique as this new allegation may sound, I could also confirm its painful presence on the map as being bang on correct. The word on the streets had it that a piece of iron had somehow got lodged in his testicles or phallus or groin area, another obvious flighting of his virility. Well, as amazing as it may seem, at the top of this shadow Christ's right thigh, and a mere 2 miles from the tender area of his genitals on this scale, but a gnat's whisker away, there's a prominent high peak, the highest around, which is painfully emblazoned with the name of Iron Band. If an iron band had appeared on the head of Ares or the bare rump of Virgo, it would have meant absolutely zilch, yet lodged here in the groin area of this particular giant, it means plenty. It means we have lifted the green mantle of the land and caught the last elusive fish of Albion, the enigmatic rich Fisher King, now established as another succulent slice of the whole gorgeously mythological sandwich, which is Albion. Moreover, he must also be a pointer to the fact that here, near the end of our journey, the Grail, the essence of all we've seen, is ready to materialize, but only if we can now ask nature, and in particular this communicative Isle of Albion, all the right questions. By just looking at the map with new eyes, those questions might already be forming. And we must ask these questions before the zodiacal clock strikes 12. Curiosity, however, still urged me to ask, why iron? So I looked for help from Robert Bly's book Iron John, a book about men, a work plumbing the depths of the lost male psyche, and where I'd already found word of the above iron-related wound. Bly goes on to point out that, in fairy stories, iron was usually associated with the imprisonment of men, whereas glass had the same effect upon women. He fascinated me further by quoting from the Brothers Grimm tale of the Water of Life, in which a young man, Grail Knight, has to pass through many trials in his quest to bring back the water of life to heal his sick father, the Fisher King perhaps. A princess then tells the lad where to find the fountain, to me all very Lady Lune-like, but advises that he must draw the water before the clock strikes 12 o'clock. Anyway, he accomplishes his task in the nick of time and with a bucket full of the precious water beats a retreat, but, so the story goes, just as he was passing through the iron gate the clock struck 12 and the gate slammed with such force that it took off a piece of his heel. Enthralled, though still none the wiser as to why iron, I sent my eye again roving around that phallus in the landscape. I was still wondering whether the truth behind those fabled waters of life was in the fountain-like spouting of the river Lune. What I found there would again defy coincidence. Just 2 miles downhill from that peak of Iron Band is a wayside marker with the absurdly rewarding name of Swinging Gate. Again, don't ask me what the hell it all means, for I am as breathless at the sight of its provocative entry into the scheme of things as that young man was to get through it on time. And who wouldn't be breathless after running 2 miles with a bucket of water? But why do I throw in that 2 miles, for the brothers Grimm make no mention of distance? Well, it's also the distance from the tip of Albion's phallic fountain, from where the lad might have filled his bucket with the waters of life, to that swinging gate at the base of Iron Band. And he can only just have been on time, because this reanimated scene just so happens to be placed at the 12 o'clock high station on Albion's zodiacal clock. Uncanny, isn't it? I would dearly have loved to question those not-so-grim reapers of a field or two of Albion's gold. Or then again, were they two just unsuspecting helpers of Albion, recording what they thought was an original yarn, yet one being breathed out by a landscape in readiness for that time when the myth would be found to be land-sculpted into a gigantic truth? We'll never know, of course, and what's more, we don't need to know, just enjoy. Incredibly, we have accounted for all the Fisher King's mystic wounds, from genitals to thighs, all of them explicitly and accurately marked upon this dark twin as astonishing evidence of how he once showed himself to another age. Indeed, the wounds are so unique to that medieval version of the consort that, like dental records, one cannot fail to accurately identify the body from them. Though having said that, there is still that side wound to account for, and although I found no mention of the Fisher King having suffered such an injury, what I did discover only added to my simmering fascination. You see, it's also recorded that the Fisher King received his wounds from the lance of Longinus, the very same one that the centurion used to pierce the side of Jesus while he hung upon the cross, and from where also poured blood and water. My, how these twins share each other's pains! Scotland's Lake of Learning? Clock strikes 12. While we are still gathered at the shore of these wound-like lakes, glinting upon the loins of this giant, how would you like to hear about a dream a grail-questing knight once had, and wherein Jesus appears to wash himself in a lake which, wait for it, welled out of the loins of a king? Interested? So was I. Before you hear it, here's a history lesson. Did you know that Hadrian's Wall has not always marked the border between England and Scotland, and that the border was once the best part of 40 miles further into England? I didn't, but upon finding this out my first thoughts were that the bulk of these twins is upon previously Scottish soil, hitherto conspicuously left out of Albion's magic garden. Anyway, armed with this snippet, we can return to the dream as recorded by our old friend Walter Map in the Quest del St. Graal. According to Walter, it was a certain highly honoured Celadon whom Christ sent to become the first Christian king of Scotland, and whom Sir Lancelot now sees, and I can only assume in gigantic topographical form, in a surreal Grail dream, this figure, all set about by stars, those field-fallen ones of Albion, I wonder? And when reading the following, who wouldn't start putting 2 and 2 together big time, a great lake which welled from out of his loins. Don't blame me for getting all hyper when reading things like this. Especially when seeing that this particular giant that we're standing upon is a king stretched out on previously Scottish territory, and who is welling lakes aplenty from his loins, not to mention being all set about by stars to boot. Let's face it, these are not an everyday coupling of features. But let's hear the rest of that dream before you judge whether my excitement was warranted. Lancelot then sees 9 rivers flowing from out of this same lake, and then, a man came down from heaven, in outward sign and feature like our Lord. When he had come to the lake, he washed his hands and feet in it and in the rivers one by one, and when he came to the 9th, he washed his hands and feet and whole body. The knight later relates the entire dream to a wise hermit who advises that this Scottish King Celadon is the son of Nashon, whom our Lord sent to this land to confound and crush the unbelievers. This man was verily a servant of Jesus Christ and God's true knight. He knew as much as the philosophers, or more, about the course of the stars and planets and the laws that govern the firmament. Mystically weird and wonderful for sure, but don't we moonlit ramblers feel tremendously familiar ground again, especially on when the wise hermit goes on. He was a very lake of learning and of science in which the fisher after truth might find the principles and moving force of the divine ordinance. Wow, is not all of this bewilderingly juicy when juxtaposed to what we see of this dark twin's body of evidence? And would a fisher after truth, standing upon this lake-sprinkled Fisher King, realize the beautiful force that has created such a fabulously divine thing from out of the Ordnance Survey map of Britain? It is also enticing to ask whether, when Jesus bathed in that lake's waters, it was a gesture, not only of the wisdom he gleaned from finding this giant in a landscape, but also a sign and seal that they were in truth reunited as the blood brothers they really were. If so, and if this Celadon really was but a romantic front for the king of nature we're journeying upon, you too can now go and bathe in the same. Note, one wonders if Jesus did find the Fisher King, whether he then, in a sense, took the mantle of that Grail King. This would fit with what is sometimes suggested in the Grail romances, namely that the Grail-achieving knight then took over the Fisher King's guardianship of the cup. So could Jesus himself be the ultimate Fisher King whom we must now all find? Intriguing, too, how the symbol of the fish was to become so associated with the Christ. Find the place where Bran's head once was, and you might find the Fisher King in residence. Staying with lakes of learning, the following could also prove interesting for us now musing on the banks of one particular thigh wound. Researchers into what could have been earlier sources of inspiration behind the Grail romances and their characters are pretty convinced that the Mabinogion supplied a lot of the detail. As far as the role of the Fisher King is concerned, it is felt that the giant Bran the Blessed, we mer him under Sagittarius, might have been the prototype, Bran being not only a former keeper of the Grail in the shape of its earlier incarnation as the Cauldron, but also receiver of an eventually fatal wound, albeit to his heel, the same as the boy received when passing through the swinging gate. On face value, however, I always thought this tie-up a touch flimsy, but let's see what the land has to say about it. Anyway, when Bran was dying from his battle wound, incidentally, received from the Irish Scorpio, he asked his loyal hand of warriors to sever his head so that at least that part of him would, for a while after, magically continue to give verbal succor to his peoples. He asked them to carry his head to a small island called Gwales, where they alone would find a palace wherein time would stand still, and for a period a state of bliss would settle on this battle-weary group. Thus, Bran's own miraculously talking head became, for a time, a veritable replacement of the Cauldron of Inspiration, which had been destroyed in that same battle in Ireland, and Gwales was the place chosen to host this Grail-like experience. So where is this Gwales, we ask? The thought is that it is the island of Grahome off the Pembrokeshire coast, and you might be intrigued to know that, over 200 miles away to the northeast, one of this Fisher King's reservoir thigh wounds, now flashing in our faces, is called Grassholm. Why, we've even found Bran's cauldron, in the shape of that great wheel of the Tees, submerged, but still present in this king's side wound. And, by the way, guess where Bran said he found that cauldron in the first place? In a lake. It had belonged to the gigantic mother and her son. Sorry for all these exclamation marks. But that's not all the evidence that points to Bran's presence around this giant. In Welsh, the name Bran means either crow or raven. Look over your shoulder then and into this wild twin's already raven-labeled eyes. Suffice to say that where you find blood-stained Grassholm, the raven-eyed head of Raven Bran must also be near, and this is another sign that the Cauldron of Grail quest must be at boiling point. His mission half accomplished. If Jesus' gesture of washing in his giant twin's lake wound ever occurred, or is still to occur, Jesus could not have been more forthright in demonstrating that this twin was a blood brother, one whom he had perhaps found again in the wilderness, a wilderness that may be partly allegorical of the disharmony ensuing from man's lost kinship to nature, and in doing so he had reconciled the high and low of his own dual nature. I think also that this washing, an act akin to Thomas' own touching into Jesus' wounds, could be encouragement for all to follow suit, to acknowledge the absolute truth of all supernature, Albion's miracle being the sublime eternal proof of the divinity residing throughout the entire creation, and personified in this consort of the land. When speculating upon Jesus having a need to find some wild side of his nature, like Thomas, I applied sharp and doubting brakes many times to what could have been my over-active intuition. It was, therefore, most comforting to find encouragement spoken by India's own Lord of Fertility, Shiva. I'd like to think that his words are spoken on behalf of all who are wrapped here in the land's green-blanketed amalgam of sons of the soil, and that we should add more names to those already listed, so not only Shiva, but Hermes, Cernunnos, Enkidu, Priapus, Herne the Hunter and of course Pan, he from whom the word panic first sprang. All of these are lords of vegetation and good shepherds of the beasts, but most of all lovers of life itself. So hear all of them, through Shiva's voice, firing up the artist, and calming down the rabbit. With the confidence that his landscape-led eye is not so mad after all, I am lord of the animals. It is not degenerate to recognize one's animal. Only those who practice the rites of the brothers to the beasts, the Pashupata, can surpass their animal nature. And, can I add on to the end of that, and become truly gods on earth, just as Jesus became. Shiva thus underlines that, without first being united with the great underworld of nature, we may never really know how high we can fly. Through the intermediacy of nature, as this miracle of Albion surely shows, is the doorway to the buried God, not only in nature but deep within ourselves, and Jesus washing in this giant's wound, albeit only in someone's dream, would seem to visually underwrite Shiva's advice. I believe that Jesus' own efforts in acquiring the sense of his own holy wild other half would have been the main object of his journey to this whole miracle in the landscape, or wilderness if you like. Thus when Jesus either stepped out of that gaping mouth of Cetus the whale, sea Pisces, or came dripping out of his wild twins Lake Wound, he could have, under Shiva's guidance, grasped in spirit his brother's fur and feathered hand, and in doing so became tinglingly aware that he was now brother and sister to every tree, fox and even stone. He could converse with hawk or wolf, or hang in sublime limbo within the preparation of sweet scents and blueness gathering within a bluebell bulb in February. And in this reconciliation with nature I believe he may have been halfway to becoming a dancing godman. In experiencing the holy depths, he had completed half of his mission in acquiring the consciousness of a Christ. This same experience could now be open to us all. It is indeed a pity we didn't take up the offer when made so passionately 2 years prior to 1914's expansion of the wasteland, by James Stevens in his hauntingly beautiful piece of fiction touching upon truth book The Crock of Gold. Between the lines of this curious work, I feel this same wild sun made a plea for us to face him and learn to truly love our existence. Alas, the plea was all too soon answered by cries that stretched from the Somme to Hiroshima, and indeed ever since to the tune of men behaving like no animal ever could. And so I want to let Stevens' own voice of the pleading wilderness run free across these my own pages. In the following piece it is devil-branded Pan who beseeches a shepherdess to acknowledge his innocent presence, and thus her own holy wild nature. If you listen hard enough, though, the same words can now be caught on the breeze, rolling out of his mouth of meadow flowers and muir which is Melmaby, and it's you he beseeches to look him in the raven eye and know yourself. I am afraid of you, said the girl. You fear me because my legs are shaggy like the legs of a goat. Look at them well, O maiden, and know that they are indeed the legs of a beast, and then you will not be afraid any more. Do you not love beasts? Surely you should love them, for they yearn to you humbly or fiercely, craving your hand upon their heads as I do. If I were not fashioned thus I would not come to you because I would not need you. Man is a god and a brute. He aspires to the stars with his head but his feet are contented in the grasses of the field. And when he forsakes the brute upon which he stands, then there will be no more men and no more women, and the immortal gods will blow this world away like smoke. I don't know what you want me to do, said the girl. I want you to want me. I want you to forget right and wrong, to be happy as the beasts, as careless as the flowers and the birds. To live to the depths of your nature as well as to the heights. Truly there are stars in the heights and they will be a garland for your forehead. But the depths are equal to the heights. Wondrous deep are the depths, very fertile is the lowest deep. There are stars there also, brighter than the stars on high. The name of the heights is wisdom and the name of the depths is love. How shall they come together and be fruitful if you do not plunge deeply and fearlessly? Wisdom is the spirit and the wings of the spirit, love is the shaggy beast that goes down. Gallantly he dives, below thought, beyond wisdom, to rise again as high above these as he had first descended. Wisdom is righteous and clean, but love is unclean and holy. I sing of the beast and the descent, the great unclean purging itself in fire, the thought that is not born in the measure or the ice or the head, but in the feet and the hot blood and the pulse of fury. The crown of life is not lodged in the sun, the wise gods have buried it deeply where the thoughtful will not find it, nor the good, But the gay ones, the adventurous ones, the careless plungers, they will bring it to the wise and astonish them. All things are seen in the light, how shall we value that which is easy to see? But the precious things which are hidden, they will be more precious for our search, they will be beautiful with our sorrow, they will be noble because of our desire for them. Come away with me, shepherd girl, through the fields, and we will be careless and happy, and we will leave thought to find us when it can. For that is the duty of thought, and it is more anxious to discover us than we are to be found. So Caitlin Ni Marachu arose and went with him through the fields, and she did not go with him because of love, nor because his words had been understood by her, but only because he was naked and unashamed. I do not apologize for quoting that lengthy discourse between Pan and a young maiden, for I feel its wisdom song, no matter where Stevens first heard its ravishing sound, is the quintessence of all that Albion beseeches. Accept then that this twin, however you name him, is one half of you. Accept and begin to reclaim the full and magical potential of your physical existence, your oneness with nature. Allow him now to take your left hand and lead you through your realm of an earthly paradise. Like a laughing child, allow him to teach you again what shivering bliss it is to sensuously unwind as a fern frond in May time, to fly at the tip of an arrowhead flight of honking migratory geese against a massive autumnal sunset. Or know what dreams bears have in their winter sleep, for such I think could be even more than halfway towards reclaiming the consciousness of a Christ. Who then, after finally recognizing the God in themselves, and existing in even the most minuscule particle of the creation, would allow an atomic test blast to turn the seabed to slop, an animal to be used in laboratory testing, or one gene to be manipulated with only good businesses as the prime motivation behind doing so? I think it is maybe now imperative, due to the accelerating danger our protracted ignorance is placing the whole planet in, for all mankind to be ushered towards some whole new perception of our existence before it is too late, and for this cause, I think, Albion has arrived. But coming back to Lancelot's dream, whether it has anything to do with Albion's ground plan or not, I still put it to you that the land's placement of Jesus and this cloven-footed fellow upon the same cross, and, in particular, their sharing of that same right hand, is as forthright a gesture as any washing in wounds could be. I think this pairing on the cross is meant to be shocking, and I think that the land is telling us that this mixing of the yin and yang at Golgotha culminated in some tumultuous and magnificent crescendo, resulting there and then in the metamorphosis of a man into a God-man. Thus, contrary to what the Bible has told of that afternoon, it might have been that within Jesus was as much ecstasy as agony. Instead of his body slumped, there was a body somehow imperceptibly dancing throughout its every cell, and rather than a man dying, there was one being literally born again within that same body, though for heaven's sake please don't confuse this, being born again with today's in vogue Christian expression. However, to follow through this theory, that I'm sure the land is willing us to accept before we reach the splendor of the gift it's got waiting for us at journey's end, we must become one of those careless plungers, earlier recommended by Pan himself, for the rational thinker has absolutely no chance of following where we go next. Notes, legend has it that at the exact moment Jesus was supposed to have died upon the cross, Pan also died. This exciting snippet for us, contemplating Jesus and Pan upon the same cross, stems from a tale about a seafarer off the coast of Italy, who heard a voice exclaim at that moment when blackness engulfed Golgotha, "Tell them that great Pan is dead." A shout that was followed by a global weeping. It is interesting too that Hermes, previously mentioned in the list of blackened twins, was the god of thieves, so perhaps this is a further hint that the robber who went to paradise with Christ was all the time representative of a god, albeit of the underworld? Building up to a color-coded metamorphosis. It was while I was upon my first mental visit to these thigh wounds, with the sun edging its way up to the horizon, and you, my fellow travelers, following with me a compass reading between both black and white, that the following theory began to dawn on me. You see, for an artist it would sooner or later, especially with the mystic inference here of twins of opposite polarities becoming one, come down to color, and I was mentally going to mix black and white together and come up with a neutral gray. As I did, and as the glow from that rising sun began to mix its own light with the black of night, the word twilight rose into my mind like a smile, though insisting I explore the reason why. Twilight, what an enchanting time of day it is, though more often than not it slips by unnoticed. And as one thought always leads to another, I then began wondering whether that yearning middle light could suggest, in Albion's poetical way, a meeting between the motherly night and the fatherly day, a mystic yet very visible twice-daily reminder of their wished-for mixing of fundamental polarities. I then toyed with the thought of transferring that twice-daily condition of light, that tremulous pregnancy which gives birth to either night or day, onto these twins. As I did, up popped the crazy question as to whether in these overlapping twins' own merged polarities could be suggested the creation of a neutralizing, or counterbalancing condition, symptomatic of that middle way, out of which a new son could rise, a God-man no less. Or was insanity creeping in again? Either way, with that thought came a bolt of instantaneous excitement. Was the sight of a Christ of light sharing the same cross and right hand as his dark twin, promoting a balanced twilight, as another subtle clue to the mystic chemistry which may have been going on behind the scenes at Golgotha? And was this something which, although it passed unrecorded in the Bible, the land detected and recorded in so mighty a fashion for a time when all men would have to themselves face personal Golgothas, and thus have a need to know a truth to which they had been blind for too long? Crazy, and yet again strangely pleasing. Comforting even, the vibe I got back from such a palette of possibilities. I know it sounded stupid, childish, too damn simple to be taken seriously, but exactly that which had been my mainstay in finding the rest of this miracle. So I went with the flow, my inner eye mixing a poetically fizzing neutral grey where the twins overlapped each other, upon the high peaks of England. And as I did that counterbalancing light and all it stood for was to grow more magical still. Twilight, what a magical ring the word has, and was that chi in any way suggestive of two? Did twilight actually mean two lights? So, a new set of thoughts ran upon the shore of these lakes of learning, and I plunged my hand deep into an imaginary rucksack at my feet, and pulled out a dictionary in search of a meaning as to where such flowing thoughts were now taking me. Lighting an equally imaginary match, the word chi flickered off the page and confirmed my hunch. It really was an Old English word for two, and thus twilight really did mean two lights. Another nice buzz of Albion reassurance tickled the back of my neck, but then I began to wish I hadn't bothered to scroll through what else the dictionary had to say about twilight itself. Condition of imperfect knowledge, understanding, etc., followed by the twilight of the gods, destruction of the gods, and the world in conflict with the giants. Ouch, the match burnt my finger and went out. Suddenly my thinking that twilight was brewing itself into some kind of key that would unlock a secret ulterior reason for dark and light to overlap upon the same cross, seemed now shaped only to open a Pandora's box of ill omen. I confess that I nearly didn't bother to read the very last listing of my dictionary's assassination of my daft hunch. Nevertheless, I mentally struck another match and in its flare got back the shivers of astonishment which were to race down this madman's spine for a good hour afterwards, for it was to be another of those Albion moments which not for the first time had come to save my backside just when doubt looked like getting a big piece of it. Anyway, that spellbinding last line said, twilight sleep, a partial narcosis for dulling the pains of childbirth. Rocket fuel or what? For an intuition that had for so long been journeying through pictures that possibly pertained to some ultimate birthing of an inner Christ child, and which was now speeding after something that may have been left unsaid from that afternoon at Golgotha, a chase triggered purely by Albion's own black and white imagery, nailed like a challenge to its own masthead rendition of that passion. I was thus primed to ask whether twilight was, in Albion's picture sign language, indicative of a half-alive, half-dead, limbo, some strange in-between state experienced by Jesus on that cross, or later in the tomb. A state which was all the time cushioning what amounted to his own mystic birthing of that inner Christ child, a Christ consciousness, a self-rebirthing, or if you like, resurrection by any other name. And yet, to all uninitiated eye, would the person going through such an inconceivable metamorphosis look, to all intents and purposes, as if they had slumped in death? Were my thoughts inexcusably naive? Or was this really more of the same happy-go-lucky way of peeking just beyond the obvious, and spying a wonder that had always been staring us in the face? Was this just another big helping of what had already torn away the veil from the miracle beneath my feet? Furthermore, if it was more of the same tripping over of wonders, it would mean, dare I say, that Jesus did not die on the cross. Indeed, the land demanded me to dare. And I looked towards where it had already raised that 95-mile-tall Geminian Christ-child, that token babe of our dormant, yet ever wanting to be reborn, inner Christ consciousness. As I looked I couldn't help but smile when seeing again that child carries Liverpool as its own sleeping smile. Why, even in Jesus' own landscape depiction, his eyes are alive with running water, and I knew I wasn't being naive. I just knew the land was daring me to conclude that when Jesus hung upon that cross he was being accompanied by his underworld twin, again maybe in the shape of the robber at his side, and that, in that extraordinarily emphatic sharing of their right hands, there is the proof that we really did miss something very beautiful in that first performance of the play of passion. We missed understanding that within the birth of that God-man was swirling some awesome embrace of yin and yang so profound, that it was fit to birth a wonder-child, a Christ-child, within the fabric of a mere man. Note, in drawing our attention to the robber as reflected in Jesus' eyes, might the land be telling us that Jesus became a Christ by virtue of seeing and acknowledging his brother's value and divinity? Remember though, brothers cannot by themselves conceive a child, but they could create the perfect neutralizing condition of utmost harmony, and balance into which the fundamental male and female aspects of the one God could meet within so as to copulate, conceive, and give birth to a wonder-child with eyes open and looking out of the man in all but 3 days. Let's chase the idea some more. Golgotha through new eyes. Wearing Albion's X-ray specs we've now jumped through the looking glass, it's 2,000 years ago and we're looking up at Jesus, eyes closed, his slumped upon his nails, but it's seeing just beyond the obvious, and with a map of northern England under our arm, let us dare to perceive that behind his outward agony there just may be an inner ecstasy beneath that death-like pallor, an expectant glow building from a twilight sleep, a partial narcosis for dulling the pains of childbirth? Is he, via all the wisdom he has attained in his short but spectacular life, at the core of himself holding the hand of a twin in a mystic mixing of polarities, and creating an inner balance or twilight, a neutral bridge over which sundered lovers can meet and unite? Then, staring with even wider eyes, can we accept that the scene is set for the Sky Father, the male aspect of the one God, to descend that cross to meet the mother force which is itself ascending the cross from the holy depths of the planet? And where the vertical meets the horizontal do those two fundamental forces become rightfully one in a sacred marriage within the man, who has offered himself, through his asking of all the right questions, to be their bridal chamber. In that inconceivable agony and ecstasy of that orgasmic fusion of lovers, too long separated by mankind's refusal of the divinity of his dual nature, we see that mere man, who gives them entry, becoming the ultimate product of that same holy union. In short, via his parents' mystic intercourse is he rebirthing himself as their only fully aware son, one who would, upon the third day, venture out from that womb of a tomb as the only man in all the world who truly knew that not only is he God, but so too is all else. A God-man who, in mastering his one foot in heaven and the other on earth, could, according to his startled disciples, and as adept as any spirit would, pass through a locked door and appear within their room, yet at the same time displaying the still open and warm wounds of a physical and still very much alive man. Indeed, he was to ram home the point of his humanness by also showing those same amazed disciples that he was as hungry as a horse by tucking into their broiled fish supper to boot. Let us stay a little longer at the foot of the cross. While you stare on, notice that as the dance of those divine lovers is spiraling within him, his side is pierced for a reason, and perhaps not just to see if he was dead. For his blood must be so pulsating with that transformational and fundamentally neutralizing chemistry caused by the inner marriage, that Providence needs it to spill into Joseph of Arimathea's Grail cup as a token for all men to thereafter drink of the same experience. Indeed, even as you view those two rudely nailed planks that form the cross, be aware of the secret language of sexual union of which they may be singing. I'll let B.Z. Goldberg in his book The Sacred Fire the story of sex in religion translate. By further simplification it was enough to draw a vertical line to suggest the lingam and a horizontal one to signify the yoni, while the union of the two was represented by the cross. It seems, then, that Jesus hung exactly where the line spelt copulation. To sum up what we're watching, I put it to you that the perfectly balanced yin and yang swirling within the core of Jesus has created the partial and blissfully stilling, twilight narcosis needed to withstand the orgasmic agony and ecstasy that would allow the inner Christ child to be born out of pure love. This, then, rendered Jesus dead to all intents and purposes. He was taken into that womb-like tomb where some metamorphic chemistry would continue under the knowing eye of Joseph. Then, on the third day, the day of the Son, he could rise with reborn perception so boundless that he could, spirit-like, mix his atoms with a bolted door and enter a room full of shaking disciples, and yet, as a man, delight to share in their fish supper. Simply, he become a God-man, a being who could know the best of both worlds, could know heaven while still on earth. He could love a woman and make a baby, and yet be able, too, to merge his atoms with Saturn's rings, could relish his supper and yet, while he was eating, know the mind of the mountain beyond the window. Not even the angel Gabriel himself could know such dualistic bliss. At the height of that mystic intercourse within Jesus, he would have literally become Father, Mother, and Son. So here Jesus in the Gnostic Apocryphon of John confirmed this. John, John, why do you doubt and why are you afraid? I am the one who is with you always. I am the Father, I am the Mother, I am the Son. And if sleeping upon the cross whilst going through some initiatory-like transformation sounds like more spin from yours truly to bolster my interpretation of Albion's cross, listen to Catherine Maltwood in her Enchantments of Britain discussing a form of initiation practiced in ancient Egypt and India. The initiated adept, who had successfully passed through all the trials, was tied to a cross, in deep sleep, and allowed to remain in that state for 3 days and 3 nights, during which time his spiritual ego was said to confabulate with the gods, descend into Hades. She continues, at a certain hour the beam of the rising sun struck full on the face of the entranced candidate, and like Hercules he was born again. Those words of born again also have me remembering how in the chapter Ares of Part 1 we found how the River Eden, aided by the Swindale Beck, formed a navel connecting placenta and umbilical cord for that land Christ. Mightily intriguing in the context of all this birthing upon the cross stuff. Nice not being alone. These thoughts, promoted by pictures in a landscape, may seem all weird and stark raving heretical, and all too easy to write off as the ramblings of a madman. I think I would have finally concluded the same if I had not, along this strange and challenging way, come across others who have periodically had courage enough to stand up and risk being labeled a crank, by sharing their intuitively led thoughts. These thoughts so often mirrored my own and which I'd thought, until then, original to myself, triggered as they were solely by this miracle, and consequentially, because what the hell did I know, highly dodgy. And so, as all the above weirdness begs a little of your time in the hope of finding, against all the odds, a comfortable resonance somewhere within you, I ask you to also weigh alongside it a few more seemingly ridiculous theories. These were propounded by other, carefree plungers, so see for yourself how this land now gives even their ramblings a tangible vote of approval, and this especially exciting for us with improper thoughts of sex upon the cross. Take for instance when, under cancer, I first suggested sexual undertones in the capacity of the cross to become the mast of the ark, realizing it could also be representative of the phallus of the male, sun, aspect of God penetrating the mother's body of the crescent, moon-shaped ark. Now take that eccentric theory, along with a mental picture of the new sun being poetically reborn upon this same cross and crescent floor plan of coupled opposites, and weigh it against these far-sighted words of another one-time hunter of the Grail, the late and still well-respected Walter J. Stein. Christ unites sun and moon in the earth, and whoever can behold the union of the sun and moon in the earth, beholds the Holy Grail. The union will indeed only be fulfilled in the future, but Christ has by his sacrificial deed given a turn to world evolution that shall lead to that event. And still with thoughts that the cup-like lunar crescent of Albion's ark could be allegorical of the mother's body, read this from Alan Danielou. In Persia, the moon was called Gaithra, the cup where the primal bull deposited his semen. I find it fascinating that if topographical semen in the form of the river Lune is pouring downwards from this dark lord's phallus, it is also running down this same cross a master phallic jed pillar towards that feminine cup or body of the ark. Need I also remind you that that same semen trail has the moon written all along it in its name of Luna. Indeed, boggle your mind still further by also tallying that Persian, primal bull, way of seeing things with the fact that Osiris was himself seen as a bull. So, if Osiris is indeed one of the many masks of this dark twin, see how that bull really is ejaculating into the very cup of the moon. Arc. Is this not a massive hint that some sacred sexuality was at work upon the cross, so powerful that it allowed a man to give birth to a poetic wonder-child within himself? Further support might come from the Nag Hammadi's Gospel of Philip, especially so if we agree that in a sense, Jesus was, in his enfolding of the sundered lovers, presenting himself as their bridal chamber. If the woman had not separated from the man, she should not die with the man. His separation became the beginning of death. Because of this, Christ came to repair the separation which was from the beginning and again unite the two, and to give life to those who died as a result of the separation and unite them. But the woman is united to her husband in the bridal chamber. Indeed, those who have united in the bridal chamber will no longer be separated. And this. The Lord did everything in a mystery, a baptism and a chrism, and a Eucharist, and a redemption and a bridal chamber. Philip also states that anyone who would be initiated into such mysteries would be, no longer a Christian but a Christ. Lastly, my thanks go to that preeminent scholar of mythology, Joseph Campbell, and his interviewer Bill Moyes in their book The Power of Myth. And as on many other occasions, I came across the following some time after formulating my translation of what I saw upon Albion's mapped-out cross. It was so comforting to all my theories regarding twilight, the neutral middle way, and the joining of opposites as pertaining to the experiencing of the Grail. Here Campbell relates a little-known background to the Grail's coming down to earth. There's a very interesting statement about the origin of the Grail. One early writer says that the Grail was brought from heaven by the neutral angels. You see, during the war in heaven between God and Satan, between good and evil, some angelic hosts sided with Satan and some with God. The Grail was brought down through the middle by the neutral angels. It represents that spiritual path between pairs of opposites, between fear and desire, between good and evil. Towards the end of their discussion upon the Grail comes this exchange. Moyes, is this what Thomas Mann meant when he talked about mankind being the noblest work because it joins nature to spirit? Campbell, yes. Moyes, nature and spirit are yearning for each other to meet in this experience. And the Grail that these romantic legends were searching for is the union once again of what has been divided, the peace that comes from joining. Tell me, don't you think these landscape twins, one of the spirit and one of nature, are nailed to one cross, poetically and visually applaud every word of the above conversion? Thanks to these others then, I'm quietly confident that when the wheat is separated from the chaff of all I've dropped in your lap regarding this landscaped rerun of the crucifixion, there'll be enough good stuff left over to weigh with what the land has done to signal that, yes, something extraordinary really must have gone on behind the scenes of that first Good Friday, revolving around a play of sacred sexuality, the almighty outcome of which was to not only give birth to a flesh and blood Godman, but to also rubber stamp that long-held belief wherein the balancing of the yin and yang was central to the transmutation of the mundane into the magnificent. Indeed, what Albion has kept back as its final pictorial masterstroke will, on its own account, rubber stamp the evidence, nearly 50 miles high, that pied, and thus neutral, was the inner chemistry that had Jesus dancing off the cross as a Christ. But please don't flip to that last chapter just yet. Note, just a passing thought here, if Osiris is wrapped up in the shape of this twin, there may also be the seed of a reason why this many-named lord of the underworld ended up with a pair of devilish horns, for Osiris, as well as Isis, was known to have worn a horned crown. Also, because the landscape has willed that my suspected Osiris should share the same right hand as Christ, indeed the same nail, and because I mused on how a reborn Christ could perhaps commune with a wolf or condense the essence of himself into the bulb of a bluebell, whilst still in the flesh, perhaps the following may add extra weight to this my idea of what true resurrection could be all about. It comes from an ancient text inscribed in the tomb of the Egyptian prince Paheri. Thou becomest a living soul. Thou hast power over bread, water, and air. Thou changest thyself into a phoenix or a swallow, a sparrowhawk or a heron, as thou desirest. Thou livest anew, and thy soul is not parted from thy body. Defining the body. Time now to leave symbol and speculation behind and concentrate upon this most wonderfully tangible evidence underfoot. For what can't speak can't tell any lie. My initial source of reference in the finding of this twin was the Bartholomew map as reproduced in John Parker's book Cumbria, A Guide to the Lake District and its County. However, this was to be greatly supplemented by the Ordnance Survey Travelmaster 5 map of northern England, along with the OS Land Ranger series, numbers 86, 90 and 91. To begin with, find Croglin crowning the top of his great head, while Croglin Water single-handedly outlines the left side of his tumbled hair, and most of the top of the head, until it meets that wonder water of the River Eden. That river then takes over to outline the cascading locks of the right side, just as it does for Jesus, down to his heaving shoulders. The connecting road between Rennick on his forehead and Croglin describes the distinctive, and Jesus-like, center parting of his hair. For the face-shaping inner hairline we'll start from Kirkoswald, heading to nearby High Bank Hill and onwards to Rennick, where we'll be aiming to take the lane out to Outhwaite. Once there we'll need the footpath that will take us to the forest. This also fills in as his left eyebrow, and where we'll branch left in the hope of picking up the Lou Gill. If we then head along its bank in a southeasterly direction, we should come across a well-defined track, which crosses its flow. This, if we follow it to the right, will lead us into the lane which, in drawing his jaw, tumbles us south and eventually into the busy A686. Head south on this, but only until you spot the lane on the right, which will take us along the top of his moustache, past Hazelrig and onto the tip of his nose at a point just south of Unthank. Returning to Kirkoswald, his hair will frame the right side of his face. Leave the village at its southern end and take the lane to the left that should bring you alongside some castle ruins. Here we pick up a footpath that will take us all the way down to Glassenbybeck, then a better quality lane should have us marching into Glassenby itself. Once here we just follow the upper edge of his moustache to Gamblesby just beneath his nose. To complete the beard's outer shape it's best to start from Langworthby on the right shoulder, into which the River Eden has already tumbled his hair. From Langworthby run a little east along the shoulder on the A686, turning off southwards to Owlsby, as this village, I'd say, sits upon his beard's pointed tip. Unfortunately, there is no visible line to complete the left side of the beard. That said, the whole head is so well defined that virtually no imagination is needed to fill in where the line of his beard should go. However, perhaps beyond the scope of my maps there may be some subtle feature of the landscape, maybe even a dry stone wall, which could denote the missing line. His nose is far easier to spot. From Rennick on his forehead just follow south the direct route to Unthank. Keep on going and you'll see the same lane will bend round into Gamblesby and give that nose a lovely hooked end. Carry on through Gamblesby and you're again following the upper edge of his moustache to Glassenby. As for the mouth, we've already seen how that track south of Gamblesby, which connects Melmerby Mire back to the village of Melmerby, denotes its grimace. And now those closed raven eyes. East of Kirkoswald, we can pick up the Raven Beck subtly describing the closed cup of the right eye before it flows over the bridge of the Rennick to the Unthank nose line in an effort to do the same for the left eye too. It must be pointed out, though, that this section, which runs through Hareskew, could well be a feeder stream to that Raven Beck and perhaps may even bear a different name. That said, that blue line still conspires with the Raven Beck to present a very decent pair of cupped eyes. The lane that connects Ravenbridge Mill, nearly in the corner of this left eye, to Hareskew and beyond to Selah also provides very good backup to the work of the stream in denoting the left eye. Indeed, I'd say that lanes could, in their own right, do a half-decent job in describing both closed eyes. Begin at Kirkoswald and just truck on down the lane which heads eastwards through Housegales, thereafter crossing that nose line as an even narrower lane-come track, which, if you follow to its end, will have you eventually upon Skelling Moor. However, nothing beats what the Raven Beck does and all it stands for. Groucho's own. Oh, and I nearly forgot a lovely pair of Groucho eyebrows, ever so charmingly shaped by two horizontal strips of perfectly placed woodland. Over the right eye it's the wood surrounding Nether Hareskew, while the left one is raised just north of Hareskew proper. Now that the face is complete we'll trace the shoulders and the tops of both outstretched arms. Starting with the right, the main A592 and its easterly flow into the A686 etches its upper contour, the same line having already delineated the top edge of the cross-horizontal beam. His right hand is, as you know, Jesus' own, while the arm's lower contour is precisely that which denoted the top edge of Jesus. Superb economy of line or what? The A686 describes the top of the left arm as far as the turn off to the village of Catton. After Catton it's Allendale town. We want, all the time drawing the knuckles of this left hand. Now we need the unmarked lanes to head us back west, passing through Carshield and Colso, before crossing over the A689 into Nenthed and Garrigill that nestles in the armpit. Just an observation here, the lanes around Catton lend themselves to the shaping of a forefinger, pointing to either Hexham or a place called Low Gate, or indeed some other spot well beyond these two. Whether or not there is any significance in this, I don't know. Going back to Garrigill in the armpit, Garrigill, it's now southwards down the left side of his body, admirably drawn by the B6277 through Teesdale to Middleton in Teesdale, thereafter picking up first the B6282 and then the B6279 on the wounded left thigh as we head to Staindrop, and the top of his bent knee. Now curve southwest around it on the B6274 to Winston, or if you prefer a meander along some tranquil waterways you could do almost precisely what the road has just done, even sailing into Ovington where we're due next. From Ovington we go to Hutton Magna, Newsham on the Shin, and continue over Barningham Moor by still following the only road it's possible to take all the way along the top of this left foot into Marske, where toes should be. I'll come back to this. Anyway, go right on through Marske for its Fremington we want on the side of the right foot, around about the position of its little toe. However, once there, let's just backtrack slightly by going back out of Fremington some 2 miles to Marwick. If you follow the same lane through that village it'll have you completing a potato-like shape back again to Fremington, which at the same time, describes the finest big toe in all Albion, Marwick being its nail. This veritable cartoon of a big toe is especially apparent on the Ordnance Survey Travelmaster 5 map. That terrible foot. But that big cartoon of a toe then almost forces one to look back at the left foot, which seems nailed upon top of the right. As one does, you realize what might be the message, for the left markedly lacks a similar toe. Moreover, one becomes aware that it has no toes at all and is instead wonderfully cloven. This club of a foot is pointedly cleft by the track that goes from Marske to Skelton and eventually to a dead end. A stream also cuts the same course. So one foot, the left a mother's yin side, rightfully cloven and thus caked in primordial mud. This an emphatic reminder of man's brotherhood with the beasts of the fields. One foot in heaven, the other in earth, is again shown as the true pedigree of us all. But also get a load of this, especially if one of the many masks of this darker twin is Dionyse, or if you're thinking, why only 1 foot cloven? Come hither, Dionyse, to thy holy temple by the sea, come with the graces to thy temple, rushing with thy bull's foot. O goodly bull, O goodly bull. This, according to Fraser, was how the women of Ellis hailed him, and do note that bull's foot is in the singular. In Hurst find the hurt. We start again at Fremington and head northwestwards to draw the underside of his more human right foot, sculpted by the Arkle beck that flows along Arkingarthdale. If his foot is nailed against this straight edge, surely we're being told the name of the ship whose mast must bear him. The Ordnance Survey Travelmaster 5 map asks another highly intriguing question of these feet, and we get to the point of it by following a track from Marwick to Hurst that outlines the top of the right foot, and actually separates this right foot from the left hoof. Anyway, in following this otherwise straight wilderness track from Marwick you'll notice that it's capped as though by a short T-bar, its left arm ending in Hurst, while going right leads to nowhere but a complete dead end. In doing so it surprises by throwing a tiny, and what seems on the map to be entirely needless right angle. So why that bent back bit? I don't know, but oh how it tempts the eye to see it as the bent over head of a crude nail, and if you hit that nail on the head does that place name of Hurst hide the hurt? Too true, for Hurst is exactly where such a crucifixion nail would bite. See line drawing. Leaving the feet, or foot and hoof, on we go now to Lanthwaite upon the heel. Just beyond here it's back northeast through the Slang to join the A66, thereby completing the calf muscle of his right leg. This same once well-flogged road of Rome's legions will take us northwest to Bruff at the beginning of the buttock. After Bruff, and not long after passing the village of Warcop on your left, we shall branch off this highway by taking a right to Hilton upon quieter lanes. Then we pass through Merton, Dufton, and Knock before picking up the stream that runs out of the Crowdundle Beck to Newbegin, again being pulled to that magnet of Temple Sowerby which nestles in this particular giant's right armpit. This same spot on his brother marks the top of the right shoulder. So rest a while here amid the underarm scent of the Green Man, a perfume from Temple Sowerby's 20,000 daffodils and Lent lilies. Carry on now by following the upper contour of Jesus' right arm, as this cunningly denotes the underarm of his twin. Thus is completed their shared right hand and nail. Heart of hearts. So that leaves only the place of his heart, and what a heart, here at Crossfell, aptly the highest point of his entire high-peaked frame, this same place already having been such a boon in helping me earlier to find the coordinates of the cross itself. This mount is an admirable marker for the great thumping heart of the mother's son and consort, especially so with the Ordnance Survey Land Ranger map number 91 in your hand, for see how it's even heart-shaped too. 1 mile is its pumping width and befittingly. Described by Bellamy and Quayle as the epicenter of England's last great wilderness, yet again, well said, sirs. See following line drawing. His heart must have been even wilder some 1,500 years ago, when it was said St. Paulinus scaled its height in order to drive out the demons who had made it their stronghold, all wonderfully evocative of him whose heart it is. Having cleaned up the joint, the saint then raised a cross upon the spot to mark the coming of Christianity to this apex of Albion. But, I ask, was he, by this gesture, being used to proclaim this twin as holy after all? Or was he signposting this same place as the linchpin of Albion's colossal cross beneath? Either way, thanks to St. Paulinus. More powerful land poetry comes with the news that from this same high fell the mighty river Tees has its birth, thereafter trickling like a rivulet of blood down this giant's chest to fill that cow-green reservoir wound upon his side, thus his grail wound is visibly filled from his own heart's blood. Marks of further approval. To complete our checklist of the eponymous clues that identify exactly whom we're treading on, I would like to add a few extra last-minute giveaways that may also be useful in the final reckoning of both his character and role. First of all, note North Stainmore, South Stainmore, Stainmore Common and Stainmore Forest, for all are gathered in the area where his thigh wounds are visually weeping trickles of blood in the shape of many streams, and thus poetically staining the entire area. Historically, too, blood stains this area, for it was here that the battle raged wherein the last of the Viking kings in England was dispatched to Valhalla, his name, Eric Bloodaxe. Another sign, and one which we have already found on the body of Jesus, perhaps now needs reappraisal seeing that it also falls upon this his pagan reflection. Wild boar scar, that geological tear upon the shoulder of Jesus, which had us wondering if the memory of those old gods of rejuvenation, Attis and Adonis both killed by wild boars, was being recorded here, alluding perhaps that they too lay in the multi-mythological layers beneath the Christ. However, this scar falls far more dangerously on his twin, being but 1 inch away from his heart. It seems to me then that the presence of Attis and Adonis, corn gods both, is validated, and that they are here exactly where they should be within the wrappings of this the darker lord. So why isn't this twin shown upon the cover? In Christendom, and so for the best part of 2,000 years, this twin has been condemned as evil, though ironically, and thanks to the medieval stonemasons, he has still gained entrance into many a church under the guise of the Green Man, often up there amongst the rafters and gleefully spewing oak and hawthorn over the heads of congregations. It's a pity then that I had not the guts of those masons, for my artwork bears no trace of him. You see, I completed the colored artwork at the time when I was happy to con myself that he wasn't there, and although I guess I could have painted him in once I'd come to my senses, I nevertheless decided that I wouldn't, for in my own ignorant banishment of him that 2,000 years worth of misunderstanding and downright fear is succinctly underlined. So let that blank space remain, a challenge to each individual to reinstate him into the gap within their own lives, and in so doing re-acknowledge their own holy cloven foot. Indeed, let that blank space, instigated by my own fear, serve as a reminder for all time of the beauty that fear and ignorance can repress. Fearlessly then, we go into the last mile of our journey. Note, why, if I earlier placed Lucifer, or a diseased faction of the negative force, in Scorpio, do I now also pinpoint him on the cross? In answer, I feel that, in Scorpio's banishment from the main body of the zodiac, the land is illustrating just how dangerous it is for us to create, albeit ignorantly, divisions and imbalances in our lives and environment, for they will be reflected back upon us time after time. Whereas in his portrayal upon the cross we see how, rather than dividing, if we join and rebalance we may know paradise on earth.